I was trying to gently fade the music out instead of just abruptly stopping it. Thanks for joining, everybody. Welcome to Grow the Info, where I like to present you with good information that is nonpartisan and you could verify yourself and all that kind of good stuff. No mainstream media regurgitation around here. That's what I like to say. So thank you for joining, everyone. We are going to be streaming the impeachment trials. Today is the 7th day in the Senate for the trials. We have streamed most of the hearings and trials previously, and we have them all in a playlist if you want to check that out. Yesterday we did cut our stream short for another hearing that was happening, a House hearing regarding Mr. President Trump's use of air strikes in Iraq and the whole Iran situation. So check that out if you want to see that as well. And there is another hearing that I am interested in that's coming up at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, which will be at 1 o'clock Central Standard Time. I'm split over whether I should just continue showing the impeachment trials or if I should switch to the other one. I'm thinking, though, maybe I'll just stay on the impeachment trials because you guys seem to be wanting to watch that, and I can just, maybe pay attention to the other hearing and let you guys know what's going on. But the other hearing that is happening has to do with protecting whistleblowers. So, as an independent journalist, I'm kind of interested in that. I might have to just do a whole nother separate video summarizing that. I don't know, we'll see. I stream so much, who knows. So they're about to start in about 5 minutes. If you don't know what the impeachment articles are specifically, there is a PDF that is linked in the description box that you can go to be able to see the complete impeachment articles, and it details everything in there. And there's also a PDF link for a lot of the arguments that both sides have been making, both the Democrats and Republicans. So we have heard from President Trump's lawyers a bit so far. We heard from the House managers, of course, quite a lot. So we are continuing now to hear from Mr. President Donald Trump's lawyers and in the defense of him. Yesterday they talked quite a bit about Burisma and about Hunter Biden, but everybody's kind of waiting to see if they're going to talk about this new Bolton revelation, wherein apparently in the book that he just wrote, he says that, Trump did tell him that the aid was dependent on Ukraine announcing investigations into the Bidens. But, of course, if it's a book, then, sometimes people put things in books and exaggerate to be able to sell stuff, which is actually the point that Mr. President Trump made regarding that allegation. He said that if Bolton did say anything along those lines, it was just to sell a book. So, I don't know. What do you guys think about that? You can let us know in the chat box. We always have the chat going, and you can let us know in the comments down below if you're watching the replay. And thank you guys so much for joining, whether you're live or watching the replay. You guys are what help promote us. We're not promoted by the algorithms. YouTube's not helping us with that. We're not a big enough channel to be promoted, and even if we were, I don't try to filter what I say. So, it's you guys. All of the growth that this channel is having is you guys. So thank you so much for that. You guys are awesome. And if you're new, make sure that you have subscribed by hitting the red subscribe button. You can turn on bell notifications by hitting the bell. And you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at GrowTheInfo is our handle. And our website, growtheinfo.com. We put out long press release lists, recall notices, all kinds of good other information. So make sure you guys check that out. And by the way, if you missed our morning stream yesterday where I covered a little bit of the news, there have been 2 recent recalls, one for over 2,000 pounds of raw beef due to small clear pliable plastic bits being in it. And of course, if you think about the logistics of you taking some raw beef and putting it in a frying pan that is warm and then the grease melts and goes all bubbly, well, that's kind of what the plastic is gonna do too. So make sure that you check that out. I did list in that video the places that the beef was shipped to, but I can't remember them off the top of my head right now. So check that out. And also there was a recall for Silliform. If you don't know what Silliform is, it is catfish. So there's a certain type of catfish products that were being recalled. So make sure you check out our stream from yesterday. Thank you guys again for joining. And we got 2 minutes. We got 2 minutes until they start. 2 minutes of me rambling, you guys. Oh dear. This is where everything's going to get derailed. Let's put it on this screen. And I know everybody is really concerned about the Wuhan flu virus that's going on around right now. Well, actually, it's a coronavirus. So, be aware of that. If you don't know anything about that virus yet, you could look up hashtags like coronavirus or Wu flu. Some people are calling it Wuhan virus. Those are some good tags to look up to get information on it. The information is consistently breaking and always new information. I have been trying to complete a video on this, but with all of the breaking information that's going on, it's hard to be like, well, should I include this? Should I not? So make sure you subscribe, that way you catch that video when I put it out, because that actually is going to have to do again with Silliforms, which are catfish, remember. And where did the Wuhan flu virus thing start? Apparently in a fish market, but I don't hear anybody talking about fish. So there's a lot of speculation, though, of where it could have come from. If you guys want to, talk about that in the chat box, that's fine. We don't have really rules about staying on topic or, you having to support this side or that side. We're open to anybody here. So whatever your view is, feel free to be able to chat. I welcome everybody. I'm not just going to kick somebody out just because I disagree with you, or if you bring up something that's totally off topic. It's cool. It's all gravy, baby. And it looks like they are starting, so I'm going to stop rambling. Otherwise, I'll just go on and on. Thank you guys so much for joining. You're wonderful.
The Senate will convene as a court of impeachment, and the chaplain will lead us in prayer.
Let us pray. O God, you are our rock of safety. Protect us in an unsafe world. Guard us from those who smile but plan evil in their hearts. Use our senators to bring peace and unity to our world. May they permit godliness to make them bold as lions. Give them a clearer vision of your desires for our nation. Remind them that they borrow their heartbeats from you each day. Provide them with such humility, hope, and courage that they will do your will. Lord, grant that this impeachment trial will make our nation stronger, wiser, and better. We pray in your strong name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please be seated. If there is no objection, the journal of proceedings of the trial are approved to date. Without objection, so ordered. The Sergeant-at-Arms will make the proclamation.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silent on pain of imprisonment while the Senate of the United States is sitting for the trial of the articles of impeachment exhibited by the House of Representatives against Donald John Trump, President of the United States.
Mr. Chief Justice.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
We expect several hours of session today with probably one quick break in the middle.
Thank you. Pursuant to the provisions of Senate Resolution 483, the Counsel for the President have 15 hours and 33 minutes remaining to make the presentation of their case, though it will not be possible to use the remainder of that time before the end of the day. The Senate will now hear you.
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. Members of the Senate, just to give you a very quick, brief overview of today, we do not intend to use much of that time today, Mr. Chief Justice. We intend to be, our goal is to be finished by dinner time and well before. We'll have 3 presentations. First will be Pat Philbin, Deputy White House Counsel. Then Jay Sekulow will give a presentation. We'll take a break if that's okay with you, Mr. Leader, and then after that, I'll finish with a presentation. So that's our goal for the day, and with that, I'll turn it over to Pat Philbin.
Mr. Chief Justice, members of the Senate, Majority Leader McConnell, Minority Leader Schumer, I'd like to start today by making a couple of observations related to the abuse of power charge in the first article of impeachment. And I wouldn't presume to elaborate on Professor Dershowitz's presentation from yesterday evening, which I thought was complete and compelling, but I wanted to just add a couple of very specific points in support of the exposition of the Constitution and the impeachment clause that he set out. And it begins from a focus on the point in the debate about the impeachment clause at the Constitutional Convention, where maladministration was offered by George Mason as a grounds for impeachment. And James Madison responded that that was a bad idea. And he said, so vague a term will be equivalent to a tenure during the pleasure of the Senate. And that evinced a deep-seated concern that Madison had, and it's part of the whole design of our Constitution, for ways that can lead to exercises of arbitrary power. The Constitution was designed to put limits and checks on all forms of government power. Obviously, one of the great mechanisms for that is the separation of powers, the structural separation of powers in our Constitution. But it also comes from defining and limiting powers and responsibilities, and a concern that vague terms, vague standards are themselves an opportunity for the expansion of power and the exercise of arbitrary power. And we see that throughout the Constitution and in the impeachment clause as well. And this is why, as Gouverneur Morris argued in discussing the impeachment clause, that only few offenses, he said, few offenses ought to be impeachable, and the cases ought to be enumerated and defined. And that's why we see in the debates at the Constitution, many terms had been included in earlier drafts when it was narrowed down to treason and bribery, and there was a suggestion to include maladministration, which had been a ground for impeachment in English practice. The framers rejected it because it was too vague. It was too expansive. It would allow for arbitrary exercises of power. And we see throughout the Constitution in terms that relate and fit in with the impeachment clause the same concern. One is in the definition of treason. The framers were very concerned that the English practice of having a vague concept of treason that was malleable and could be changed even after the fact to define new concepts of treason was dangerous. It was one of the things that they wanted to reject from the English system. So they defined in the Constitution very specifically what constituted treason and how it had to be proved. And then that term was incorporated into the impeachment clause. Similarly, in the rejection of maladministration, which had been an impeachable offense in England, the framers rejected that because it was vague. A vague standard, something that's too changeable, that can be redefined, can be malleable after the fact, allows for the arbitrary exercise of power. And that would be dangerous to give that power to the legislature as a power to impeach the executive. And similarly, and it relates again to the impeachment clause, one of the greatest dangers from having changeable standards that existed in the English system was bills of attainder. Under a bill of attainder, the Parliament could pass a specific law saying that a specific person had done something unlawful, they were being attainted, even though it wasn't unlawful before that. And the framers rejected that entire concept. In Article 1, Section 9, they eliminated both bills of attainder and all ex post facto laws for criminal penalties at the federal level, and they also included a provision to prohibit states from using bills of attainder. Now, in the English system, there was a relationship to some extent between impeachment and bills of attainder because both were tools of the Parliament to get at officials in the government. You could impeach them for an established offense, or you could pass a bill of attainder. And it was because the definition of impeachment was being narrowed that George Mason at the debate suggested. And he pointed out, in the English system, there's a bill of attainder. It's been a great useful tool for the government, but we're eliminating that, and now we're getting a narrow definition of impeachment. We ought to expand it to include maladministration. And Madison said no, and the framers agreed. We have to have enumerated and defined offenses, not a vague concept, not something that can be blurry and interpreted after the fact, and that could be used essentially to make policy differences or other differences like that the subject of impeachment. All of the steps that the framers took in the way they approached the impeachment clause were in terms of narrowing, restricting, constraining, enumerating offenses, and not a vague and malleable approach as there had been in the English system. And I think the minority views of Republican members of the House Judiciary Committee at the time of the Nixon impeachment inquiry summed this up and reflected it well, because they explained, and I'm quoting from the minority views in the report, the whole tenor of the framers' discussions The whole purpose of their many careful departures from English impeachment practice was in the direction of limits and of standards. An impeachment power exercised without extrinsic and objective standards would be tantamount to the use of bills of attainder and ex post facto laws, which are expressly forbidden by the Constitution and are contrary to the American spirit of justice. And what we see in the House manager's charges and their definition of abuse of power is exactly antithetical to the framers' approach, because their very premise for their abuse of power charge is that it is entirely based on subjective motive, not objective standards, not predefined offenses, but the president can do something that is perfectly lawful, perfectly within his authority. But if the real reason, as Professor Dershowitz pointed out, that's the language from their report, the reason in the president's mind is something that they ferret out and decide is wrong, that becomes impeachable. And that's not a standard at all. It ends up being infinitely malleable. And it's something that I think a telling factor that reflects how malleable it is and how dangerous it is in the House Judiciary Committee's report. Because after they define their concept of abuse of power, and they say that it involves your exercising government power for personal interest and not the national interest, and it depends on your subjective motives, they realize that that's infinitely malleable. There's not really a clear standard there. And it's violating a fundamental premise of the American system of justice, that you have to have notice of what is wrong. You have to have notice of an offense. And this is something that Professor Dershowitz pointed out last night. There has to be a defined offense in advance. And the way they try to resolve this is to say, well, in addition to our definition, high crimes and misdemeanors involve conduct that is recognizably wrong to a reasonable person. And that's their kind of add-on to deal with the fact that they have an unconstitutionally vague standard. They don't have a standard that really defines a specific offense. They don't have a standard that really defines in coherent terms that are going to be identifiable what the offenses are. So they just add on, and it's got to be recognizably wrong. And they say that they're doing this to resolve a tension, they call it, within the Constitution. Because they point out, and this is quoting from the report, the structure of the Constitution, including its prohibition on bills of attainder and the ex post facto clause, implies that impeachable offenses should not come as a surprise. And that's exactly what Professor Dershowitz pointed out. And everything about the terms of the Constitution, speaking of an offense and a conviction, that it's all crimes should be tried by jury except impeachments, they all talk about impeachment in those criminal offense terms. But the tension here isn't within the Constitution. It's between the House manager's definition, which lacks any coherent definition of an offense that would catch people by surprise, and the Constitution. That's the tension that they're trying to resolve, is between their malleable standard that actually states no clear offense and the Constitution and the principles of justice embodied in the Constitution that require some clear offense. So I wanted to point that out in relation to the standards for impeachable offenses, because it's another piece of the constitutional puzzle that fits in with the exposition that Professor Dershowitz set out. And it also shows an inherent flaw in the House manager's theory of abuse of power, regardless of whether or not one accepts the view that an impeachable offense has to be a crime, a defined crime. There is still the flaw in their definition of abuse of power, that it is so malleable, based on purely subjective standards, that it does not provide any cognizable notice of an offense. It is so malleable, it in effect recreates the offense of maladministration that the framers expressly rejected, as Professor Dershowitz explained. The second point that I wanted to make is that how do we tell, under the House manager's standard, what an illicit motive is, when there's an illicit motive? How are we supposed to get the proof of what's inside the president's head? Because, of course, motive is inherently difficult to prove, where you're talking about, as they've conceded, they're talking about perfectly lawful actions on their face within the constitutional authority of the president, but they want to make it impeachable if it's just the wrong idea inside the president's head. And they explain in the House Judiciary Committee report that the way we'll tell if the president had the wrong motive is we'll compare what he did to what staffers in the executive branch said he ought to do. So they say, quote, that the president, quote, disregarded United States foreign policy towards Ukraine, end quote, and that he ignored, quote unquote, official policy that he had been briefed on, and that he, quote, ignored, defied, and confounded every agency within the executive branch, end quote. That is not a constitutionally coherent statement. The president cannot defy agencies within the executive branch. Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution vests all of the executive power in a president of the United States. He alone is an entire branch of government. He sets policy for the executive branch. He's given vast power. And of course, within limits set by laws passed by Congress, and within limits set by spending priorities, spending laws passed by Congress, he, within those constraints, sets the policies of the government. And in areas of foreign affairs, military affairs, national security, which is what we're dealing with in this case, foreign affairs, head of state communications, he has vast powers. As Professor Dershowitz explained, for over 2 centuries, the president has been regarded as the sole organ of the nation in foreign affairs. So the idea that we're going to find out when the president had the wrong subjective motives by comparing what he did to the recommendations of some interagency consensus among staffers is fundamentally anti-constitutional. It inverts the constitutional structure. And it's also fundamentally anti-democratic, because our system is rather unique in the amount of power that it gives to the president. The executive here has much more power than in a parliamentary system. But part of the reason that the president can have that power is that he is directly democratically accountable to the people. There is an election every 4 years to ensure that the president stays democratically accountable to the people. But those staffers in these supposed interagency who have their meetings and make recommendations to the president are not accountable to the people. There is no democratic legitimacy or accountability to their decisions or recommendations. And that is why it is the president, as head of the executive branch, who has the authority to actually set policies and make determinations, regardless of what the staffers may recommend. They're there to provide information and recommendations, not to set policy. So the idea that we're going to start impeaching presidents by deciding that they have illicit motives if we can show that they disagreed with some interagency consensus is fundamentally contrary to the Constitution and fundamentally anti-democratic. So those were the 2 observations I wanted to add to supplement specific points on Professor Dershowitz's comments from last night. Now I want to shift gears and respond to a couple of points that the House managers have brought up that are really completely extraneous to this proceeding. They involve matters that are not charged in the articles of impeachment. They do not relate directly to the president or his actions. But they are accusations that were brought up somewhat recklessly in any event, and we cannot close without some response to them. And the first has to do with the idea that somehow the White House and White House lawyers were involved in some sort of cover-up related to the transcript of the July 25th call because it was stored on a highly classified system. So let me start with that. The House managers made this accusation there was something nefarious going on. But let's see what the witnesses actually had to say. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, and remember, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman is the person who was listening in on the call and who raised a concern, the only person who went and raised a concern with NSC lawyers that he thought there was something improper, something wrong with the call, even though he later conceded under cross-examination it was really a policy concern, but he thought there was something wrong. And he had to say that he did not think, he said, "So I do not think there was malicious intent or anything of that nature to cover anything up." He's the one who went and talked to the lawyers. He's the one whose complaint spurred the idea that, wait, there might be something that's really sensitive here. We should make sure that this is not going to leak. He thought there was nothing covering it up. His boss, Senior Director Tim Morrison, had similar testimony.
So to the best of your knowledge, there's no malicious intent in moving the transcript to the compartmented server?
Correct.
And the idea that there was some sort of cover-up is further destroyed by the simple fact that everyone who, as part of their jobs, needed access to that transcript still had access to it, including Lieutenant Colonel Vindman. Right? So the person who raises a complaint still has access to the transcript the entire time. And this is the way Mr. Morrison's testimony explained that.
And even on the code word server, you had access to it.
Yes.
So at no point in time during the course of your official duties were you denied access to this information?
Correct.
Is that correct? And to your knowledge, anybody on the NSC staff that needed access to the transcript for their official duties always was able to access it, correct? People that had a need to know and a need to access it?
Once it was moved to the compartmented system?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, as Mr. Morrison testified, he had recommended restricting access to the transcript, not because he had any concern that there was anything improper or illegal, but he was concerned about a potential leak. And as he put it, how that, quote, would play out in Washington's polarized environment, end quote, and would, quote, affect the bipartisan support our Ukrainian partners currently experience in Congress. And he was right to be concerned potentially about leaks because the Trump administration has faced national security leaks at an alarming rate. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman himself said that concerns about leaks seemed justified, and it was not unusual that something would be put in a more restricted circulation. Now, what else is in the record evidence? Mr. Morrison explained his understanding of how the transcript ended up on that server.
I spoke with the NSC Executive Secretariat staff, asked them why, and they did their research and they informed me it had been moved to the higher classification system at the direction of John Eisenberg, whom I then asked why. I mean, if that was the judgment he made, that's not necessarily mine to question, but I didn't understand it. And he essentially told me I gave no such direction. He did his own inquiry, and he represented back to me that his understanding was that it was a kind of administrative error, that when he also gave direction to restrict access, the Executive Secretariat staff understood that as an apprehension that there was something in the content of the MEMCON that could not exist on the lower classification system.
So to the best of your knowledge, there's no malicious intent in moving the transcript to the compartmented server?
Correct.
Everyone who knew something about it and who testified agreed there was no malicious intent. The call was still available to everyone who needed it as part of their job, and it certainly wasn't covered up or deep-sixed in some way. The president declassified it and made it public. So why we're even here talking about these accusations about a cover-up when it's a transcript that was preserved and made public is somewhat absurd. Now, the other point I'd like to turn to, another accusation from the House managers, is that the whistleblower complaint, when the whistleblower complaint was not forwarded to Congress, they've said that lawyers at the Department of Justice this time, they accuse OLC, the Office of Legal Counsel, of providing a bogus opinion for why the Director of National Intelligence did not have to advance the whistleblower's complaint to Congress. And Manager Jeffries said that OLC opined, quote, without any reasonable basis, that the acting DNI did not have to turn over the complaint to Congress, end quote. And the way he portrayed this, now there's a statute that says if the Inspector General of the intelligence community finds a matter of urgent concern, it must be forwarded to Congress. And Manager Jeffries portrayed this as if the only thing to decide was, were these claims urgent? He said, quote, "What could be more urgent than a sitting president trying to cheat in an American election by soliciting foreign interference?" That's not the only question. The statute doesn't just say if it's urgent, you have to forward it. It talks about urgent concern as a defined term. Now, if the House managers want to come and cast accusations at the political and career officials at the Office of Legal Counsel, which we all know is a very respected office of the Department of Justice, provides opinions for the executive branch on what governing law is, they should come backed up with analysis. So let's look at what the law actually says. And I think we have the slide of that. Urgent concern is defined as a serious or flagrant problem, abuse, violation of law relating to the funding, administration, or operation of an intelligence activity within the responsibility and authority of the Director of National Intelligence involving classified information. So the Office of Legal Counsel was consulted by the General Counsel at the DNI's office, and they looked at this definition, and they did an analysis, and they determined that the alleged misconduct is not an urgent concern within the meaning of the statute. Because they're not just talking about, do we think it's urgent? Do we think it's important? No, they're analyzing the law. And they looked at the terms of the statute. The alleged misconduct is not an urgent concern within the meaning of the statute because it does not concern the funding, administration, or operation of an intelligence activity under the authority of the DNI. Remember, what we're talking about here is a head of state communication between the President of the United States and another head of state. This isn't some CIA operation overseas. This isn't the NSA doing something. This isn't any intelligence activity going on within the intelligence community under the supervision of the DNI. It's the head of the executive branch exercising his constitutional authority, engaging in foreign relations with a foreign head of state. So in reaching that conclusion, the Office of Legal Counsel looked at the statute, the case law, the legislative history, and it concluded that this phrase of urgent concern includes matters relating to intelligence activities subject to the DNI's supervision, but it does not include allegations of wrongdoing arising outside of any intelligence activity or outside the intelligence community itself, and that makes sense. This statute was meant to provide for an ability of the Inspector General of the intelligence community, overseeing the activities of the intelligence community, to receive reports about what was going on at intelligence agencies, those that are members of the intelligence community, if there was fraud, waste, abuse, something unlawful in those activities. It was not meant to create an Inspector General of the presidency, an Inspector General of the Oval Office, to purport to determine whether the president, in exercising his constitutional authorities, had done something that should be reported. This law is narrow, and it does not cover every alleged violation of law, OLC explained, or other abuse that comes to the attention of a member of the intelligence community. Just because you're in the intelligence community and happen to see something else doesn't make this law apply. And the law does not make the Inspector General for the intelligence community responsible for investigating and reporting on allegations that do not involve intelligence activities or the intelligence community. Now, nonetheless, the President, of course, released the July 25th call transcript. And it was also not the end of the matter that the whistleblower complaint and the ICIG's letter were not sent directly to Congress, because OLC explained that if the complaint does not involve an urgent concern, but if there's anything else there that you want to have checked out, the appropriate action is to refer the matter to the Department of Justice. And that's what the DNI's office did. They sent the ICIG's letter with the complaint to the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice looked at it. And this was all made public some time ago. The Department of Justice examined the exact allegations of the whistleblower and the exact framing and concern raised by the Inspector General, which had to do with a potential of perhaps a campaign finance law violation. DOJ looked at it, looked at the statutes, analyzed it, and determined there was no violation, and it closed the matter. And it announced that months ago. All right, when something gets sent over to the Department of Justice to examine, you can't call that a cover-up. Everything here was done correctly. The lawyers analyzed the law. The complaint was sent to the appropriate person for review. It was not within the statute that required transmission to Congress. And everything was handled entirely properly. So again, actually extraneous to the matters before you, there's nothing about these 2 points in the articles of impeachment, but it merits a response when reckless allegations are made against those at the White House and at the Department of Justice. And with that, Mr. Chief Justice, I'll yield back my time to Mr. Sekulow.
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. Majority Leader McConnell, Democratic Leader Schumer, House managers, members of the Senate. What we are involved in here, as we conclude, is perhaps the most solemn of duties under our constitutional framework. The trial of the leader of the free world and the duly elected President of the United States. It is not a game of leaks and unsourced manuscripts. That's politics, unfortunately, and Hamilton put impeachment in the hands of this body, the Senate, precisely and specifically to be above that fray. This is the greatest deliberative body on earth. In our presentation so far, you've now heard from legal scholars from a variety of schools of thought, from a variety of political backgrounds. But they do have a common theme with a dire warning. Danger, danger, danger. To lower the bar of impeachment based on these articles of impeachment would impact the functioning of our constitutional republic and the framework of that Constitution for generations. I asked you to put yourself, and I'm quoting Mr. Schiff's, Manager Schiff's statement his father made about putting yourselves in the shoes of someone else, and I said, I'd like you to put yourself in the shoes of the President. And I think it's important as we conclude today that we're reminded of that fact. The President of the United States, before he was the President, was under an investigation. It was called Crossfire Hurricane. It was an investigation led by the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. James Comey eventually told the President a little bit about the investigation and referenced the Steele dossier. James Comey, the then director of the FBI, said it was salacious and unverified. So salacious and unverified that they used it as a basis to obtain FISA warrants. Members, managers here, managers at this table right here, said that any discussions on the abuse from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act utilized to get the FISA warrants from the court were conspiracy theories. I told you at the very beginning, I asked, do you put yourselves in the shoes of not just this president, of any president that would have been under this type of attack? FISA warrants issued on people affiliated with his campaign, American citizens affiliated with people of his campaign, citizens of the United States being surveilled pursuant to an order that has now been acknowledged by the very court that issued the order that it was based on a fraudulent presentation. In fact, evidence specifically changed by the very FBI lawyer who was in charge of this. Changed to such an extent that the Foreign Surveillance Intelligence Court, as I said earlier, I'm not going to repeat it again, issued 2 orders saying that when this agent, this lawyer, made these misrepresentations to the National Security Division, they also made a misrepresentation to a federal court, the federal court, the Foreign Surveillance Court, a court where there are no defense witnesses, a court where there is no cross-examination. It's a court based on trust. That trust was violated. And then the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, James Comey, decides he will leak a memo of a conversation he had with the President of the United States. And he is leaking the memo for a purpose, he said, to obtain the appointment of a special counsel. And lo and behold, a special counsel was appointed. And it just so happens that that FBI agent, lawyer, who committed the fraud on the FISA court became a lawyer for the Mueller investigation, only to be removed because of political animus and bias found by the Inspector General. Then we have a special counsel investigation. Lisa Page, Agent Strzok, I'm not going to go into the details. You know them. They're not in controversy, they're uncontroverted. The facts are clear. But does it bother your sense of justice even a little bit, that Bob Mueller allowed the evidence on the phones of those agents to be wiped clean while there was an investigation going on by the Inspector General? Now, if you did it, Manager Schiff, if you did it, Manager Jeffries, if I did that, destroyed evidence, if anyone in this chamber did this, we'd be in serious trouble. Their serious trouble is they get fired. Bob Mueller's explanation for it is, I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened. I can't recall the conversations. You can't view this case in a vacuum. You are being asked, and I say this with the utmost respect, you are being asked to remove an duly elected president of the United States. This isn't we had references to law school exams, and I love the fact that I thought there were great analysis yesterday, and I appreciate all of that. But I want to focus today, or my section, on what you're being asked to do. You are being asked to remove a duly elected president of the United States, and you're being asked to do it in an election year. in an election year. There are some of you in this chamber right now that would rather be someplace else. And that's why we'll be brief. I understand. You'd rather be someplace else. Why would you rather be someplace else? Because you're running for president, the nomination of your party. I get it. But this is a serious deliberative situation. You're being asked to remove a duly elected president of the United States. That's what the articles of impeachment call for: removal. So we had a special counsel, and we got the report. And just for a moment, putting yourselves in the shoes of this president or any president that would be under this situation, you're number 4 at the Department of Justice. His wife is working for the firm that's doing the opposition research on him and is communicating with the foreign former spy, Christopher Steele, to put together the dossier, and it's being handled by Christopher Steele through Nellie Orr to her husband, then the 4th-ranking member at the Department of Justice, Bruce Orr, and all of this is going on. And he doesn't want to tell, and he's testified to this, he doesn't want to tell everybody what he's doing because he's afraid he might have to stop. Might have to stop. How did this happen? This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And then we ask, why is the president concerned about advice he's being given? Put yourself in his shoes. Put yourself in his shoes. We've given you, and our approach has been to give an overview and to be very specific. To remove a duly elected president, which is what you're being asked to do, in essentially policy disagreements. You heard a lot about policy. Although the one that it still troubles me. This idea that the president, it was said by several of the managers, is only doing these things for himself. Understanding what is going on in the world today as we're here. They raised it, by the way. I'm not trying to be disrespectful. They raised it. This president is only doing things for himself while the leaders of opposing parties, by the way, at the highest level, to obtain peace in the Middle East, to say you're only doing that for yourself. I think the irony of that those statements were made while all of that was going on, and other acts that this body's passed, some of it bipartisan, to help the American people. Policy differences. Those policy differences cannot be utilized to destroy the separation of powers. House managers spoke for, I know we've had disagreements on the time, if it was 21 hours or 23 hours. They spoke during their time, a lot of time. Most of it attacking the president, policy decisions. They didn't like what they heard. They didn't like there was a pause on foreign aid. I laid out before that there was pauses on all kinds of foreign aid. It's not the first president to do it. But the one thing I'm still trying to understand from the manager's perspective, and maybe it's not fair to ask the managers because you're not the leader of the House, but remember the whole idea that this was a dire national security threat, a danger to our nation? We had to get this over here right away. It had to be done before Christmas. It was so important. It was so significant. The country was in such jeopardy. The jeopardy was so serious that it had to be done immediately. Let's hold on to the articles of impeachment for a month to see if the House could force the Senate to adopt rules that they wanted, which is not the way the Constitution is set up. But it was such a dire emergency. It was so critical for our nation's national interest that we could hold them for 33 days. Danger, danger, danger. That's politics. As I said, you're being called upon to remove the duly elected President of the United States. That's what these articles of impeachment call for. They never really answer the question of why they thought there was such a national emergency. Maybe they will during questions, I don't know. There was such a national emergency, they never did explain why it was that they waited. They certainly didn't wait to have the proceedings, as my colleagues have laid out. I mean, those proceedings moved in record time. I suspect that we've been here more than the House actually considered the actual articles of impeachment. Is that the way the Constitution is supposed to work? Is that the design of the Constitution? And then their question, of course, came up and yesterday on the whole situation with Burisma and the Bidens and that whole issue. And my colleagues went through that a great deal, and I'm not going to do that. But do we have are we in a situation, we used to call this, in free speech cases, like a free speech zone. You could have your free speech activities over here. You can't have them over there. Do we have like a Biden-free zone? I mean, was that what this was? You mention someone, or you're concerned about a company, and it's now off limits. You can impeach the President of the United States for asking a question. I think we significantly showed the question. I'm not going to go through a detail-by-detail analysis of the facts, but there are some that we just have to go through. You heard a lot of new facts yesterday in our presentation. Saturday, what we were pointing to is a very quick overview. And then yesterday, we spent the day, and we appreciate everybody's patience on that, going through the facts. They showed you this, but they didn't show you that. The facts are important, though, because facts have legal ramifications. Legal ramifications impact the decisions you make. So I don't take facts lightly, and I certainly don't take the constitutional mandate lightly, and we can't. The facts we demonstrated yesterday and briefly on Saturday demonstrate that there was, in fact, a proper governmental interest in the questions that the President asked and the issues that the President raised on that phone call. A phone call. Now, let's, again, put your feet in the shoes of the President. Put yourself in the President's position. Do you think he thought when he was on the call it was him and President Zelensky he was talking to and that was it? Or it was, as sometimes I heard one commentator said, it was people listening in on the call, the President and 3,000 of his closest friends. Let's be realistic. The President of the United States knew when he was on that call there were a lot of people listening from our side and from their side. So he knew what he was saying. He said it. We released a transcript of it. The facts on the call that have been kind of the focus of all of this really focused on foreign policy initiatives both in Ukraine and around the globe. They talked about other countries and other countries. The President has been very concerned about other countries carrying some of the financial load here, not just the United States. That's a legitimate position for a president to take. If you disagree with it, you have the right to do that. But he is the president. As my colleague, Deputy White House Counsel Philbin just said, that's the executive branch prerogative. That is their constitutional appropriate role. So the call is well documented. There were lots of people on the call. The person that would be on the other end of the quid pro quo, if it existed, would have been President Zelensky. But President Zelensky, and we already laid out the other officials from Ukraine, have repeatedly said there was no pressure. It was a good call. They didn't even know there was a pause in the aid. All of that is well documented. I'm not going to go through each and every one of those facts. We did that over the last several days. President Zelensky's senior advisor, Andrei Yermak, was asked if he ever felt there was a connection between military aid and the request for investigations, and he was adamant that we never had that feeling. So we talk about this whole quid pro quo, and that was a big issue. That's how this actually, before it became a impeachment proceeding, there was, as the proceedings were beginning in the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence under Chairman Schiff's role, there was all these discussions. Is it a quid pro quo? Was it extortion? Was it bribery? What was it? And we are clear in our position that there was no quid pro quo. But then yesterday, my co-counsel, Professor Alan Dershowitz, explained last night that these articles must be rejected. He's talking about from a constitutional framework, even if there was a quid pro quo, which we have clearly established there was not. And this is what he said, and I'm going to quote it verbatim. The claim that foreign policy decisions can be deemed abuses of power based on subjective opinions about mixed or sole motives that the president was interested only in helping himself demonstrate the dangers of employing the vague, subjective, and politically malleable phrase abuse of power as a constitutionally permissible criteria for the removal of a president. He went on to say, now it follows from this that if a president, any president, were to have done what the Times reported about the content of John Bolton's manuscript, that would not constitute an impeachable offense. I'm quoting exactly from Professor Dershowitz. He says, let me repeat it. Nothing in the Bolton revelations, even if true, would rise to the level of abuse of power or an impeachable offense. That is clear from history. That is clear from the language of the Constitution. You cannot turn conduct that is not impeachable into impeachable conduct simply by using words like quid pro quo and personal benefit. It is inconceivable that the framers would have intended to so politically loaded and promiscuously deployed a term as abuse of power to be weaponized, again, Professor Dershowitz, as a tool of impeachment. It is precisely the kind of vague, open-ended, and subjective term the founders and the framers feared and rejected. Now, to be specific, you cannot impeach a president on an unsourced allegation. But what Professor Dershowitz was saying, even if everything in there was true, it constitutionally doesn't rise to that level. But I want to be clear on this, because there's a lot of speculation out there. With regard to what John Bolton has said, which reference a number of individuals, we'll start with the president. Here's what the president said in response to that New York Times piece. I never told John Bolton that the aid to Ukraine was tied to investigations into Democrats, including the Bidens. In fact, he never complained about this at the time of his very public termination. If John Bolton said this, it was only to sell a book. The Department of Justice. While the Department of Justice has not reviewed Mr. Bolton's manuscript, the New York Times account of his conversation grossly mischaracterizes what Attorney General Barr and Bolton discussed. There was no discussion of personal favors or undue influence on investigations, nor did the Attorney General state that the President's conversations with foreign leaders were improper. The Vice President's Chief of Staff issued a statement. In every conversation with the President and the Vice President, in preparation for our trip to Poland, remember that was the trip that was being planned for the meeting with President Zelensky, the President consistently expressed his frustration that the United States was bearing the lion's share of responsibility for aid to Ukraine and that European nations weren't doing their part. The President also expressed concerns about corruption in Ukraine, and at no time did I hear him tie Ukraine aid to investigations into the Biden family or Burisma. That was the response. Responding to an unpublished manuscript that maybe some reporters have an idea of maybe what it says. That's what the evidence, if you want to call that evidence, I don't know what you'd call that. I'd call it inadmissible, but that's what it is. To argue that the president is not acting in our national interest and is violating his oath of office, which the managers have put forward, is wrong based on the facts and by the way the Constitution is designed. And when you look at the fullness of the record of their witnesses, the witnesses' statements, the transcripts, there's one thing that emerges. There is no violation of law. There's no violation of the Constitution. There is a disagreement on policy decisions. Most of those that spoke at your hearings did not like the president's policy. That's why we have elections. That's what policy differentials and differences are discussed. But to have a removal of a duly elected president based on a policy disagreement, that is not what the framers intended. And if you lower the bar that way, danger, danger, danger. Because the next president, or the one after that, he or she will be held to that same standard? I hope not. I pray not that that's not what happens. Not just for the sake of my client, but for the Constitution. You know, Professor Dershowitz gave a list of presidents from Washington to where we are today who, under that standard that they are proposing, could be subject to abuse of power or obstruction of Congress. Look, we know that what this is not about a president pausing aid to Ukraine. It's really not about a phone call. It's about a lot of attempts on policy disagreements that are not being debated here. My goodness, how much time? How much time has been spent in the House of Representatives hoping, they were hoping, that the Mueller probe would result in, I'm not going to play you, I was thinking about it, playing all the clips from all the commentators the day after Bob Mueller testified. Bob Mueller was unable to answer under his examination basic and fundamental questions. He had to correct himself, actually. He had to correct himself before the Senate for something he said before the House. So that's what the president's been living with. And then we're here today arguing about what? A phone call to Ukraine? Or Ukraine aid being held? Or a question about corruption? Or a question about corruption that happens to involve a high public profile figure? I mean, is that what this is? Is that where we are? And then what do we find out? The aid was released. It was released in an orderly fashion. The reform president, President Zelensky, wins, but there was a question whether his party would take the parliament. It did. They worked late into the evening with the desire to put forward reforms. So everybody was waiting, including, and you heard the testimony from, I will say, their witnesses. You heard the testimony. Everybody was concerned about Ukraine. Everybody was concerned about whether these reforms could actually take place. Everybody was concerned about it. So you hold back. Didn't affect anything that was going on in the field. We heard Mr. Crow worrying about the soldiers. I understand that. I appreciate that. But none of that aid was affecting what was going on the battlefield right then or for the next 4 months because it was future aid. And are we having an impeachment proceeding because aid came out 3 weeks before the end of the fiscal year? Or a 6-minute phone call? You boil it down, that's what this is. It's interesting to me that everybody's saying, well, the aid was finally released September 11th, only because of the committee and the whistleblower who we've never seen. Mr. Philbin dealt with that in great detail. I'm not going to go over that again. But you know, the new high court, the anti-corruption court, wasn't established and did not sit until September 5th, 2019. So while the president of Ukraine was trying to get reforms put in place, the court that was going to decide corruption issues was not set until September 5th. I want you to think about this for a moment, too. They needed a high court of corruption for corruption. I mean, think about that for a moment. Now, that's good that they recognized it. But remember when I said the other day, you don't wave a magic wand and now Ukraine doesn't have a corruption problem? The High Court of Corruption, which they have to have, because it's not just past corruption, they're concerned about ongoing corruption issues, and you could put all of your witnesses back under oath in the next hearings you'll have when this is all over, and you're going to be back in the House and we'll be doing this again, put them all back under oath, and ask them, Mr. Schiff, is there a problem of corruption in Ukraine? And if they get up there and say, no, everything is great now, hallelujah. But I suspect they're going to say, we're working really hard on it. And I believe them. But this idea that it was just vanished and now we're back into everything's fine, it's absurd. Mr. Morrison testified that while the developments were taking place, the vice president also met with President Zelensky in Warsaw. That was the meeting of September 1st. The one, by the way, where the vice president's office said, in response to this New York Times, nobody told him about aid being held or linked to investigations. Are you going to stop? Are you going to allow proceedings on impeachment to go from a New York Times report about someone that says what they hear is in a manuscript? Is that where we are? I don't think so. I hope not. What did Morrison say? He heard firsthand that the new Ukraine administration was taking concrete steps to address corruption. That's good. He advised the president that the relationship with Zelensky is one that could be trusted. Good. President Zelensky also agreed with Vice President Pence, this is interesting, that the Europeans should be doing more. And related to Vice President Pence, conversations he'd been having with European leaders about getting them to do more. In sum, the president raised two issues he was concerned with to get them addressed. Now, I've already went over, again, this is just the closing moments here of this proceeding, of our portion of this proceeding. Aid was withheld or paused, put on a pause button, not just for Ukraine. Afghanistan, South Korea, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Lebanon, and Pakistan, and I'm sure I am leaving countries out. But do you think the American people are concerned if the president says, before we give a country, I don't know, $550 million, some countries only $400 million, we'd like to know what they're doing with it. You're supposed to be the guardians of the trust here. It's the taxpayers' money we're spending. There was a lot of testimony from Dr. Fiona Hill, John Bolton's deputy. Here's what she said about aid that was being held. This is her testimony. There was a freeze put on all kinds of aid and assistance because it was in the process at the time of an awful lot of reviews of foreign assistance. Oh, you mean there was a policy within the administration to review foreign assistance and how we're doing it because we spend a lot of money. And by the way, I'm not complaining about the money. I don't think anybody doesn't want to help. But we do need to know what's going on. And those are valid and important questions. Manager Crow told you that the president's Ukraine policy was not strong against Russia. But Ambassador Yovanovitch stated the exact opposite. She said in her deposition that our country's Ukraine policy under President Trump actually, her words, got stronger than it was under President Obama. So again, policy disagreements, disagreements on approach. Have elections. That's what we do in our republic. For 3 long days, House managers presented their case by selectively showing parts of testimony. Good lawyers show parts of testimony. You don't have to show the whole thing. But other good lawyers show the rest of the testimony. And that's what we sought to do, to give you a fuller view of what we saw as the glaring omissions by my colleagues, the House managers. The legal issues here are the constitutional ones. And I have been, I think, pretty clear over the last week, starting when we had the motions arguments, that my concern about the constitutional obligations that we're operating under. I have been critical of Manager Nadler's executive privilege and other nonsense. I want you to look at it this way. Take out executive privilege. First Amendment free speech and other nonsense. The free exercise of religion and other nonsense. The rights to due process and other nonsense. The rights to equal protection under the laws and other nonsense. You can't start doing that. You would not do that. No administration has done that. In fact, since the first administration, George Washington, they wanted information. He thought it was privilege. He said it was executive privilege. But let's not start calling constitutional rights other nonsense, lumping them together. Of course, this is from a House of Representatives that actually believes the attorney-client privilege doesn't apply, which should scare every lawyer in Washington, D.C. But more scary to the lawyers would be for their clients. They say that in writing, in letters. They don't hide it. I would ask them, I'm not going to, it's not my privilege to do that. Do you really believe that? Do you really believe that the attorney-client privilege does not apply in a congressional hearing? Do you really believe that? Because then if it doesn't apply, then there is no attorney-client privilege. Or is that the attorney-client privilege and other nonsense? Danger, danger, danger. We believe that Article 1 fails constitutionally. The President has constitutional authority to engage and conduct foreign policy and foreign affairs. It is our position, legally, the President at all times acted with perfect legal authority, inquired of matters in our national interest, and having received assurances of those matters, continued his policy that his administration put forward of what really is unprecedented support for Ukraine, including the delivery of military aid package that was denied to the Ukrainians by prior administrations. You know, some of the managers right here, my colleagues at the other table, voted in favor of those, wanted Javelin anti-tank missiles for Ukraine. Some of the members here did not. Didn't want to do that. Voted against that. I'm glad we gave it to them. I'm glad we allowed them to purchase javelins. I tell you, I never served in the military. I have tremendous, tremendous respect for the men and women that protect our freedom each and every day. Tremendous respect for what they are doing and continue to do. But this president actually allowed the javelins to go. Some of you liked that idea, some of you did not. It's a policy difference. Were you going to impeach President Obama because he did not give them lethal aid? No, nor should have you. You should not do that. It's a policy difference. Policy difference do not rise to the level of constitutionally mandated or constitutional applications for removal from office. It is policy differences. By the way, it's not just on lethal weapons. And President Obama, as I said, withheld aid. He had the right to do that. You've allowed him to do that. Oh, but we don't like that this president did it, so the rules change. So this president's rules are different than, he has a different set of standards he has to apply than what you allowed the previous administration to apply, and you know what? Or the future administration to apply. That's the problem with these articles. We've laid out, I believe, a compelling case on what the Constitution requires. When they were in the House of Representatives putting this together, did they go through a constitutionally mandated accommodations process to see if there was a way to come up with something? No, they did not. Did they run to court? No. And the one time it was about to happen, they ran the other way. Separation of powers means something. It's not separation of powers and other nonsense. If we've reached now, at this very moment, in the history of our republic, a bar of impeachment because you don't like the president's policies or you don't like the way he undertook those policies, because we hear a lot about policies. If partisan impeachment is now the rule of the day, which these members and members of this Senate said should never be the rule of the day. My goodness, they said it, some of them 5 months ago. But then we had the national emergency. A phone call. It's an emergency. Except we'll just wait. But if partisan impeachment based on policy disagreements, which is what this is, and personal presumptions, or newspaper reports and allegations in a unsourced, maybe this is in somebody's book who's no longer at the White House, that becomes the new norm. Future presidents, Democrats, Republicans, will be paralyzed the moment they are elected, before they can even take the oath of office. The bar for impeachment cannot be set this low. Majority Leader McConnell, Democratic Leader Schumer, House managers, members of the Senate. Danger, danger, danger. These articles must be rejected. The Constitution requires it. Justice demands it. Majority Leader, we would ask for a short recess if we can, about 15 minutes.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
We'll be in recess for 15 minutes.
Without objection,
Okie dokie. Fun stuff. Thanks for joining Matrix Reloaded. You are awesome. You are an awesome possum. Alright, so I am going to switch over to something else quick that is going on because I am very interested in this, and they're taking a break. Alright, let's see if I can find the actual stream for this. They like to hide things. Oh yeah, now they have it right up there, of course. A little bit ago I was going all over the place trying to find it to see if it actually was live because they had to reschedule it.
Program
Here it is.
as an option for resolving certain whistleblower reprisal complaints. ADR is a voluntary process facilitated by a DoD OIG attorney in which the parties agree to use mediation to seek resolution of a complaint prior to a potentially lengthy investigative process. Since October 2017, the DoD OIG ADR program has resulted in settlements for 114 complainants and their employers. POGO has highlighted our ADR program as a model program and recommended that other IGs consider adopting similar programs. We believe that IGs also have a responsibility to be transparent with our findings, particularly when the matters involve issues of significant public concern and relate to high-level officials' actions in their official duties. We have therefore implemented a proactive release policy. We consider each of our reports of investigation, including cases arising from whistleblower disclosures and whistleblower reprisal cases, for public release. POGO also recently noted our decision to proactively release reports, calling it a powerful means of increasing the government's accountability to the public. The DoD OIG's training curriculum for whistleblower reprisal investigators is also a model program and covers all aspects of evaluating, investigating, and reporting on reprisal complaints. We regularly deliver our course to participants throughout the DoD and to other federal OIGs. In addition, the DoD Hotline hosts a worldwide outreach event each July on National Whistleblower Appreciation Day. The event recognizes the importance of whistleblowers and also provides a forum to share best practices. Finally, when whistleblower reprisal cases are substantiated, it is critical that management take prompt remedial action to make whistleblowers whole. However, recently, we have seen a disturbing trend in the DoD disagreeing with the results of our investigations or not taking disciplinary action in substantiated reprisal cases without adequate or persuasive explanations. Failure to take action sends a message to agency managers that reprisal will be tolerated and also to potential whistleblowers that the system will not protect them. In conclusion, whistleblowers regularly expose waste, fraud, abuse, and misconduct, and the DoD OIG seeks to investigate their allegations fully, fairly, and in a timely way. These whistleblowers must be protected from reprisal, and when their allegations of reprisal are substantiated, prompt corrective action should occur. The DoD OIG has made significant improvements in our handling of these important matters. We recognize that more work needs to be done, and we will continue to focus attention on this critical area. That concludes my testimony. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Fine. Good job of summarizing. Mr. Colapinto.
That's correct. Chairman Connolly, Representative Jordan, and members of the committee, my name is David Colapinto. I'm a co-founder of the National Whistleblower Center, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization in Washington, D.C. that is devoted to advancing the rights of whistleblowers. I'm also a legal practitioner who has represented whistleblowers in the government and private sectors for more than 30 years. Thank you for inviting me to testify to share my perspective. We can't begin to appreciate the courage of the women and men in the federal workforce who report wrongdoing either openly through their chain of command at their agencies or confidentially to the Inspector General or the Office of Special Counsel or even to Congress. Federal whistleblowers face such enormous risks for reporting misconduct, waste, fraud, abuse, and dangers to the public health and safety. It's a wonder that anyone does it at all. But they do it at the risk of being called a rat, a snitch, a traitor, a spy, or worse, not to mention facing discipline or removal for blowing the whistle. By contrast, the legal protections for whistleblowers in private industry, publicly traded companies, federal contractors, and even in state and local government exceed the whistleblower rights and remedies currently available to federal employees. For effective anti-retaliation protections to work, there must be, 1, a safe channel for employees to report wrongdoing confidentially. 2, strong legal remedies to address whistleblower retaliation whenever it occurs. 3, a workforce culture that supports whistleblowers and encourages them to report serious wrongdoing. Fortunately, there is a strong foundation on which to build. Congress can make whistleblower confidentiality for decades. There exists some confusion about how it works. Therefore, we suggest that Congress clarify federal whistleblower confidentiality to provide federal employees with the same remedies available under other whistleblower laws. For example, in 2014, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit held that an employer's breach of a whistleblower's confidentiality in itself was a violation of the corporate anti-retaliation statute and gave rise to an award of non-economic compensatory damages for private sector employees. In reaching this conclusion, Congress should make clear that federal employees have the same remedies in the event that whistleblower confidentiality is ever breached. Additionally, the identity of whistleblowers and other personal information about them is stored in systems of records protected by the Privacy Act. Congress should strengthen the civil remedy provisions of the Privacy Act. Second, provide district court access in retaliation cases. Federal civil servants are the only major sector of the workforce that don't have the right to bring whistleblower cases to U.S. District Court and seek a jury trial. Congress must grant this right as it has done for employees in the private sector. Administrative remedies alone do not work. The backlog at MSPB is near 2,500 cases and rising. The lack of court access is a disincentive to whistleblowing and enables the wrongdoing. Third, change the workforce culture. In 2011, the history of the whistleblowers of 1777 began to be retold, and it was discovered that the Continental Congress passed the first whistleblower law in 1778 during the American Revolution. For the past several years, the Senate has recognized July 30th as National Whistleblower Appreciation Day to commemorate the passage of the first whistleblower bill. And we appreciate members of the House, including Ranking Member Meadows, I.G. Horowitz, and others for speaking at these events. But Congress should make National Whistleblower Appreciation Day permanent to recognize the importance of whistleblowing as a fundamental policy. While this may appear to be symbolic, it would help change the culture in the federal government towards whistleblowers. It would remind us that agencies need to be held accountable for waste and other forms of serious misconduct, and it would encourage employees to report serious wrongdoing without fear of reprisal. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Colapinto. Ms. Hempowitz.
Chairman Connolly and Ranking Member Jordan, thank you for inviting me to testify as part of this hearing on the importance of protecting whistleblowers. I'm Liz Hempowitz, Director of Public Policy at the Project on Government Oversight. Whistleblowers play a crucial role in holding our government accountable, but the system is failing them. As Ranking Member Meadows has said, for those who blow the whistle, retaliation is almost certain. While Congress has codified legal protections for whistleblowers, systemic failures often undermine those protections. To address these, POGO recommends that Congress allow whistleblowers to take their retaliation complaints directly to court, ensure that whistleblowers facing reprisal are entitled to interim relief while their cases are pending, ensure that whistleblowers in the intelligence community and armed forces have access to independent enforcement of their legal protections, and rebalance the burden of proof standard applied to whistleblowers in the armed forces so they're on equal footing with civilians blowing the whistle. Expand prohibited personnel practices under the Whistleblower Protection Act to include retaliatory investigations and security clearance actions, and clarify that whistleblowers are entitled to anonymity and can enforce that right. As Mr. Colapinto just told you, federal whistleblowers are still the only major sector of the workforce that does not have the right to have their cases tried before a jury. Even contractors, who have traditionally had weaker protections than their federal employee counterparts, have this statutory right. Congress should finally allow whistleblowers to bypass the cumbersome administrative process currently in place and take their retaliation complaints directly to court. Furthermore, whistleblowers in the intelligence community lack an independent mechanism to enforce their statutory protections entirely. The last level of review in an intelligence community whistleblower's case is a panel of 3 inspectors general, whose decisions are merely recommendations that the head of the whistleblower's agency can disregard without consequence. Similarly, as Mr. Fine mentioned, the Secretary of Defense is the final decision maker when it comes to addressing retaliation against military whistleblowers. This system renders their protections all but meaningless. But it isn't just enforcement mechanisms that are failing. As Congress codifies additional prohibited actions of reprisal, those who retaliate against whistleblowers continue to adjust their approach to skirt accountability. Whistleblowers across the board are frequently subjected to retaliatory investigations, which are used to harass whistleblowers and tie up resources unnecessarily. Congress should expand prohibited retaliation across all government sectors to include these spurious investigations. And if Congress truly wants to ensure that blowing the whistle is not a career-ending decision for federal employees, it must also make retaliatory security clearance actions, such as revoking someone's clearance, a violation of the Whistleblower Protection Act. Additionally, recent events have highlighted a troubling lack of clarity around whether whistleblowers have a legal right to anonymity. For example, the Washington Post is suing the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction to force the release of the identities of individuals who spoke to the watchdog about the war in Afghanistan. While IGs are obligated to maintain a whistleblower's confidentiality unless disclosure is unavoidable, IGs are not the only people in government who are in a position to out a whistleblower. For example, if a whistleblower raises concerns with their supervisor before formally filing a complaint, then that supervisor is in a position to out the whistleblower, and the explicit prohibition in the IG Act does not apply. It's an open question whether the law currently covers outing a whistleblower as reprisal, and that should be clarified. Maintaining anonymity is one of the best ways for whistleblowers to protect themselves from professional and personal retaliation. Indeed, both this committee's majority and minority websites promise to maintain the confidentiality of whistleblowers who disclose wrongdoing to the committee. Before I conclude, I want to take a moment to address 2 pieces of misinformation about whistleblowers that have been repeated with some frequency. Some have argued inaccurately that the recent Ukraine whistleblower improperly colluded with the House Intelligence Committee before making their disclosure, and that the whistleblower's reported bias against the president undermined the disclosure. For intelligence community whistleblowers, the consequences of not following the law to the letter can be dire. Not only would it negate their ability to benefit from whistleblower protections, but they might also find themselves facing criminal prosecution, as has happened repeatedly in the past. It is entirely appropriate for a whistleblower to ask the Committee of Jurisdiction for guidance on how to proceed in compliance with the law. Furthermore, even if the whistleblower had approached the committee to make a disclosure, that would not violate the law. Congress also made clear through legislation in 2012 that a whistleblower's motive could not be used as a reason to deny them legal protections for making a disclosure. That's because motive does not determine whether a whistleblower's disclosure is legitimate. Exposing a whistleblower serves no public benefit and instead undermines the public interest in providing strong, safe channels for insiders to report wrongdoing. Whistleblowers and taxpayers alike deserve a system that makes it easy and safe for whistleblowers in any sector of government to report wrongdoing without putting their personal or professional well-being on the line. But we have a ways to go before that is the case. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Great timing. Mr. Rosenzweig.
Chairman Connolly, Ranking Member Jordan, members of the subcommittee, I thank you for the invitation to appear before you today and present testimony. My name is Paul Rosenzweig, and I'm a senior fellow at the R Street Institute. I'm also a principal and founder of Red Branch Consulting, a small consulting company, and a professorial lecturer in law at George Washington University. In addition to being a lecturer at George Washington, I am a former adjunct lecturer at the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University, where, along with 2 colleagues, I co-edited a book, Whistleblowers, Leaks in the Media, the First Amendment and National Security, that was jointly published by Medill and the American Bar Association. That work, along with my experience in the national security field, brings me here today. Though I'm generally thought of as a conservative, my testimony today is, I hope, nonpartisan in nature, since I believe that the issue of whistleblower protections is one of enduring interest to both parties and indeed to all Americans. I'd summarize my testimony with the following 4 basic points. First, in American history, whistleblowers are not an afterthought. Though they are not mentioned in the Constitution, they have a history that predates our nation's founding. Much like the free press, whistleblowers are an essential safety valve of accountability and transparency that allows America to have an effective and empowered executive branch while maintaining control over it to prevent a descent into autocracy. Second, the existing structure of whistleblower protections is, at least to some degree, grounded in constitutional freedoms and the First Amendment. Beyond that, Congress's history of support for federal whistleblowers is embodied in a series of laws, the most recent of which, the Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act of 2012, confirmed Congress's longstanding view, dating back to before the nation's founding, that providing whistleblowers with adequate protection and incentives to come forward serves American interests. Third, for that reason, it is utterly unsurprising that whistleblower protections have always had bipartisan support, both in Congress and in the courts. Figures who hold views as diverse as Senator Charles Grassley and Justice Sonia Sotomayor have spoken eloquently about the value of whistleblowers. My own view, that of a longtime conservative attorney, is that whistleblowers serve a critical function in our structure of democratic accountability. In any system where the electorate is the ultimate arbiter, the value of transparency in executive action is of paramount importance. Fourth, finally, I offer a word about the idea of confidentiality and anonymity, a topic that I know is of some controversy today. I would hope that the temper of the moment would not undermine our well-grounded belief that whistleblower anonymity, when asked for, is a fundamentally positive value. All too frequently, whistleblowers have faced retaliation for their actions. If we wish them to have a positive incentive to come forward, and I think we all agree that we do, then it is, in my view, essential to provide whistleblowers with the protection of anonymity when they wish it. All people respond to incentives, and any wise system of law will recognize that. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much. Mr. Horowitz.
Thank you, Chairman Connolly, Ranking Member Jordan, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. Information provided by whistleblowers play a critical role in the ability of inspectors general to conduct nonpartisan, independent oversight of federal programs and operations. As DOJ Inspector General and as chair of the Council of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency, or CIGI, one of my highest priorities has been to educate federal employees about the importance of whistleblowing and to ensure that those who blow the whistle are protected from retaliation or even the threat of retaliation. For example, in July 2019, as part of CIGI's enhancement of oversight.gov, CIGI launched a new whistleblower protection page that provides informational resources to assist potential whistleblowers in determining where to make a protected disclosure or where to file a retaliation claim. Also in July of last year, CIGI issued a report, Whistleblowing Works, How Inspectors General Respond to and Protect Whistleblowers, which illustrates the important contributions of whistleblowers to OIG efforts to root out waste, fraud, abuse, and misconduct, and to improve government programs. The report can be found on oversight.gov. Additionally, CIGI is actively complying with the Whistleblower Protection Coordinator Act, which this committee and Congress passed in 2018, by helping to develop best practices for handling protected disclosures and enforcing whistleblower protection laws. Let me turn briefly to CIGI's efforts to protect whistleblowers from retaliation. Whistleblowers perform an essential public service in ensuring accountability in government, and no one should be retaliated against or threatened with retaliation for bringing forward information that they reasonably believe evidences waste, fraud, abuse, or misconduct. This is not just a principle that IGs agree with, it's a principle enshrined in the law. On a bipartisan basis, Congress has passed numerous laws to protect whistleblower confidentiality and prohibit retaliation against whistleblowers. For example, the IG Act expressly prohibits for any government actor to retaliate or threaten to retaliate against a whistleblower who has brought a reasonable concern of misconduct forward. Since 1989, Congress has extended similar protections to federal contractors and grantees, intelligence community employees and contractors, and military personnel. Under each of these laws, inspectors general play a central role in receiving evidence of criminal or administrative wrongdoing because we have the independence and expertise to credibly assess the information and take appropriate steps to correct identified misconduct. And under every applicable anti-retaliation law, employees are specifically protected for disclosing information to an inspector general. When a whistleblower alleges retaliation for providing allegations of wrongdoing, inspectors general have the responsibility to conduct a thorough and independent assessment of the facts. OIG whistleblower investigations not only seek justice on behalf of whistleblowers, but also seek to deter potential future reprisals and to promote accountability for those who have retaliated or engaged in other misconduct. To effectively conduct such investigations, OIGs must have access to all relevant testimony and witnesses, including individuals who may resign or retire during the course of the OIG investigation. However, with the exception of the Department of Defense OIG, OIGs do not have the authority to compel testimony from former agency employees in whistleblower retaliation investigations or in other investigations. Our efforts to investigate whistleblower retaliation, promote accountability, and deter future misconduct have hampered our ability to receive testimony from former employees. To remedy this, SIGI has identified testimonial subpoena authority as one of its primary legislative priorities, and this committee has worked in the past on a bipartisan basis with us to support such legislation. The IG community understands the potential concerns with granting such authority and therefore supports incorporating appropriate controls to ensure this authority is exercised properly. I look forward to working with this committee, as we have in prior Congresses, to advance this crucial measure that would both enhance whistleblower protection and independent oversight. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Horowitz. Chair now recognizes the distinguished chairman of the full committee, Ms. Maloney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I thank the distinguished Chairman Conley for holding this important hearing today on whistleblower protections. Whistleblowers are vital to Congress's constitutional oversight responsibilities. They are often the first line of defense in fighting waste, fraud, and abuse. And without strong protections and the ability to remain anonymous, whistleblowers could face retaliation. This could, I believe it would, chill their willingness to report abuses to us, and that would hurt our ability to fulfill our constitutional duties of oversight. Interfering with an employee's communications with Congress is already illegal, and so is retaliating against employees who engage in such communications. But as we have seen this past year, some of our leaders do not seem to value whistleblowers in the same way that we do. For these reasons, I am working with Chairman Conley and several other colleagues on legislation to improve existing protections for whistleblowers even further. And now I want to move to questions. Mr. Hempowitz, as you know, it is well recognized that whistleblower disclosures are a vital asset in promoting government accountability and limiting waste, fraud, and abuse. Whistleblowers make disclosures at great risk to their careers and, in some cases, to their well-being and literally to their lives. And for this reason, it is absolutely essential that the confidentiality of whistleblowers is protected. And without government assurance that a whistleblower can maintain being anonymous, it will have a chilling effect may occur. So can you tell us why you believe it's important that whistleblower confidentiality be protected? And do you think that they're sufficiently protected?
Thank you for that. Thank you for that question, Chairman. Absolutely. I think anonymity should be guaranteed to whistleblowers that want it. I don't think every whistleblower wants to remain anonymous, but that should be their decision. I think not guaranteeing that right runs the risk of deterring would-be whistleblowers from coming forward, and that means waste, fraud, and abuse is not reported. So I think to make sure that whistleblowers do come forward, every protection needs to be put into the law to make sure that they have an incentive to come forward.
Okay. Mr. Colapinto, do you believe that
Thank you, Mr.
we
Chief
have
Justice,
sufficient
members of the
confidentiality
Senate.
now for
Well,
protection, or is there more
had
that
kind
we
of a
can
lengthy
do or
presentation
should do?
prepared.
There's a lot more
But
that
I
we
think-
could do.
I think
Such as?
you've
Well,
heard a lot from our
for
side,
example,
and I think we've made our case.
The
And so I just want to leave
whistleblower
you
provisions of
with
the
a couple
federal
of
civil
points.
service laws can be amended in order
First of
to
all-
make it
first of all,
actionable so that
thank you, Mr.
employees
Leader.
can bring a complaint
And thank you,
in the
Democratic
event
Leader
that
Schumer,
they
and
are
all of you
harassed or their confidentiality
for the privilege
is
of speaking on the
breached.
floor of the Senate.
There should also be stiffer
And
penalties.
for your time and attention.
The Privacy
We really
Act can be
appreciate it.
enhanced to provide for civil remedies as well. I think that Congress should also look at stiffer penalties for managers who or supervisors who may, in fact, breach the confidentiality. I have never seen arguments like we're seeing out there today, where Congress passes very clear prohibitions for OSC and the Inspector Generals not to reveal the identity of whistleblowers when they come forward confidentially, and somehow that has turned into, well, that only applies to them, so anybody else could breach the confidentiality. I think that there's a lot more that can be done to ensure that everyone gets the message that once a whistleblower goes confidential or anonymous, they are not to be unmasked.
Okay. Also, Mr. Rosenzweig, would you follow up? Do you believe there are currently weaknesses in it and for federal employee whistleblowers, and what more could we do to protect them?
Well, as Mr. Colapinto said, federal whistleblowers don't have a private cause of action against those who might disclose their identity. They have weakened protections within the workplace itself. But I think more to the point, the degradation in confidentiality and anonymity that we promise whistleblowers is eroding the ability of those federal employees who uncover waste, fraud, and abuse to transmit those allegations with the candor and forthrightness that we as citizens and you as Congress would wish to have. You must want, I think, to have a full disclosure from anybody who has such information. And by threatening confidentiality, you erode that.
And my time has expired, so I have a lot more questions. This is an important issue, and it's one that's very relevant today. I yield back. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished chair. Chair recognizes Mr. Meadows, the ranking member of the subcommittee.
I thank the chairman. I'm going to yield my time to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey is recognized for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In March of 2013, former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper spoke an untruth when he was asked by Senator Wyden if the government was collecting information on millions of Americans. 3 months later, Edward Snowden leaked documents that showed that what James Clapper said was indeed not true. James Clapper later characterized his answer as the least untruthful thing that he could say. Later, people criticized Edward Snowden for not using whistleblower protections, but then this debate came about whether contractors were covered because Edward Snowden was not an employee. I've gone back and looked at President Obama's policy directive of 2012, and it is silent on the issue of contractor and doesn't necessarily define employee. Mr. Horowitz, today, I mean, I know there have been some revisions and some changes and maybe some clarifications. Today, would a contractor like Edward Snowden be covered under the whistleblower protections if he wished to disclose the information that was in his possession that showed that James Clapper was not accurate in his answer?
Well, it's my understanding that under the law as it currently exists, that members of the intelligence community have the means by which in a whistleblower protection law specific to the intelligence community to make a report to the Inspector General and, depending upon the circumstances, have that information related.
Hate to interrupt you, but members of the intelligence community, is that defined as contractors who work in the intelligence community? Does that include people like Edward Snowden?
My understanding is that, yes, contractors can report such conduct to the IG over which agency they're working for as a contractor.
And can they also come to this committee?
I believe they then would have to follow the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act and the provisions there.
Are the rules different for them than employees?
I don't believe so, but I would.
Can an employee come to this committee?
I'm sorry?
Could an employee who wishes to be a whistleblower?
They would have to go through the steps under the law. The Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act provides the means by which that would occur.
So they couldn't come directly to this committee or another committee?
The way Congress has set up the statutory scheme is that in the intelligence community, and this is, I believe, in Section 8H of the IG Act now, employees go through their IGs who make a finding.
Employees, does that include contractors?
I believe it does.
You believe, but you're not sure, and you're the IG.
I can certainly get back to you on that.
Okay, that's really important because I think prospective whistleblowers are watching this hearing, and they want some clarity on this. I know we don't have, let me move on.
Can I answer your question?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. So contractors are afforded the same whistleblower protections under law now that intelligence community employees have, and the law says that they can go to the congressional intelligence committees.
Okay, great. I would feel more comfortable if the IGs knew that and could repeat that in a hearing here to us today. So the process, what is the process? Let me back up. Does it cover former employees? Let's say somebody's fired and they want to be a whistleblower. Can they be a whistleblower after they're fired? Do they still qualify?
For the most part, yes, sir.
Okay. And so what's the process they follow? Like a former employee that wants to be a whistleblower, Mr. Horowitz, what's the process they should follow?
So under 8H of the Act, this is, they would take it to the Inspector General for the agency that they were employed by. The Inspector General makes a legal determination about the allegation.
Okay, so
allegation is
I got
then,
30 seconds. Let me just finish this line of questioning. I'm sorry to interrupt you. So what about leaking it to a newspaper reporter? Would that work without going to the IG?
leaking it to, if it's classified information, which is what we're usually talking about in the intelligence community, you cannot leak classified information to.
Can you just leak other things? What if you leak it to an intermediary?
Actually, there's a Supreme Court case on this, McLean versus United States.
What if you leak it to an intermediary who leaks it to a reporter?
It depends on.
Let me ask you this. Did James Comey, let me just ask one last question.
Can I finish?
Did James Comey follow the proper procedure for whistleblowers when he used an intermediary to leak to the newspaper?
In 1 second.
So let me answer the question before, which is.
I'm most interested in the last question.
I'll get to that in a minute. But so there's clarity here because the FBI whistleblower laws are somewhat unique because they've been carved out of the whistleblower laws.
Can they leak to the newspaper?
No. The gentleman's time has expired.
So under the McLean case, which was a Supreme Court decision involving a then Air Marshal at the Department of Homeland Security, they attempted to fire, or did fire, that individual for disclosing information that they had not authorized the Air Marshal to disclose to a newspaper. Supreme Court found that that was a violation of the law to fire him, and that the employee was not prohibited from making the disclosure to.
Thank you, Mr. Horowitz.
So let me just, if I could, getting back to the FBI, FBI is different, and as we laid out in our report about Mr. Comey's disclosure of the information to the newspapers, that was not consistent with the procedures at the FBI.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for indulging that.
Thank you. And did you, all right. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the panel. Obviously, a very, very important topic. I just wanted to make the point, first of all, I thank all of you who pointed out that a whistleblower stepping forward, particularly when they are working inside our federal government and within agencies that have particular mission, they're anything in a way that meets the expectations of the taxpayers out there, American citizens, certainly members of Congress. So everything we can do to protect them, I think, obviously is critical. Mr. Colapinto, I want to ask you a question based on actually testimony in Ms. Hempowitz's testimony, I think written, where she talks about, we all know this, that many lawmakers, and the President, in fact, argued that the Ukraine whistleblower should not be afforded confidentiality or other whistleblower protections because the whistleblower conveyed information that was, quote, secondhand. So, Mr. Colapinto, can you just talk for a moment? Is secondhand information common from whistleblowers? Is that something that we see? Is that an important source of information?
It's very common. And in fact, earlier this month, there was actually an article published in the Harvard Business Review about an academic study or study in the field of whistleblowing, which found that secondhand information in the corporate whistleblowing context is actually more important. And it leads to more whistleblower disclosures by encouraging secondhand information. And secondhand information oftentimes is better than firsthand information because it leads to the early discovery of problems that aren't known. If you wait for the firsthand reporter, it may be far down, the misconduct may be far down the line, leading to a bigger problem. So encouraging more whistleblowing, encouraging secondhand reporting.
It's sort of like an you're saying it's kind of like an early warning system.
That's exactly what whistleblowers are, and that's what should be encouraged.
But the secondhand information in particular may be able to play that role. In a December 2019 survey, which the Government Business Council conducted of 691 federal civilian employees, 34% answered, and I quote, "The attacks on the whistleblower by President Trump and various congressional Republicans have made it much less or somewhat less likely that I will report an act of perceived wrongdoing to the appropriate authorities." Mr. Rosenweig, are you concerned about the impact of the rhetoric that we hear sometimes from some of our colleagues when they are referring to the whistleblower who alleged misconduct by the President?
Well, sir, I went to the University of Chicago. They taught us that incentives are everything, that people are essentially rational actors who respond to external stimulus. If whistleblowers perceive a greater risk to their personal livelihoods, to their employment, to their personal safety, they will be less likely to come forward. That is as sure as night follows day and rain follows the sun. So yes, it is inevitable that adverse rhetoric that challenges the integrity of or the confidentiality of whistleblowers will have the second-order effect of systematically decreasing the likelihood that whistleblowers will be willing to come forward. And that's an iron law of human nature and of economics.
And it's not just the President who's sort of undermined that perspective with respect to whistleblowers. I want to thank Mr. Horowitz and Mr. Fine and 65 other federal IGs who sent a letter to the Assistant Attorney General, Stephen Engel, writing that you had concerns that the Office of Legal Counsel's opinion would have a chilling effect on employees, contractors, and grantees. And that's an important thing to put in the record. I'd ask that we do that, unanimous consent to place that letter into the record.
Without objection.
The last thing I'd just like to ask, and any of you can volunteer and answer here, is as we've been discussing it, I've been thinking to myself, we have these statutes, obviously they're incredibly important, but creating a culture inside of the government, inside of these agencies, among supervisors, others who are going to be in a position to receive a whistleblower complaint that says this is good, this is an appropriate action for you to take, and we are here to protect you. In other words, a culture that says that this is something that's important to do and ought to be respected. What kind of training or other things happen, and could there be more to make sure that that culture, that positive reinforcing culture exists? Anybody who wants to respond could.
If I could respond, that is a key to make sure that we are training, educating employees and supervisors about their rights and responsibilities with regard to whistleblowers, and not to treat whistleblowers as traitors or anything like that, but that they provide valuable information. Not all of it is supported. Sometimes they don't know all the facts, but they should be encouraged to provide that information, and we need to investigate it fully, fairly, and take each complaint seriously. And what is important, too, as I point out in my testimony, is when we do substantiate cases of retaliation, reprisal, that management takes appropriate action. And that sends a message that reprisal will not be tolerated and that disclosures are valued. And if they do not do that in a timely way, in a full way, in a fair way, it sends the opposite message. So that's very important as well.
Thank you, Mr. Fine. Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. Thank each of our panelists for being here. Important discussion about whistleblowers, and tragically, I believe we're watching the protection of whistleblowers these days become very much twisted in politics. This is something I hear constantly in my district, the concern that certain actors within our political system at this particular point in time, especially, have weaponized the whistleblower statutes to attack the president. And case in point, while we are right here today, right now, across the way in the Senate, they are litigating a baseless impeachment case that all started with a whistleblower. Of course, there's been a lot of media attention added to the drama, but there's still a lot of questions that are surrounding the spark that got this whole thing started. Now, here's what we do know. There's a lot we don't know, but here's what we do know. On August 12th, 2019, an anonymous individual filed a complaint with the Inspector General of the intel community against the president. We know that. We also know that the individual admitted to having no actual firsthand knowledge of the events described in their complaint. Instead, they relied on rumors, secondhand information, and public news clippings. We know that. We also know the press reports have said that this individual admitted to having a close relationship with former Vice President and current presidential candidate Joe Biden. We know that this individual was in secret communication with House Intel Chairman Adam Schiff and/or his staff. So, to this day, as far as I know, Chairman Schiff is the only person who knows the identity of this particular whistleblower. Those are some things we know. There's a lot of things we don't know. A lot of questions we have, like not only the identity of the whistleblower, but whether anonymity is actually protected in this case. Does this individual, in fact, warrant whistleblower status? I think that's a legitimate question in this particular situation. The extent of the individual's political bias, and to what degree this individual coordinated with Chairman Schiff and/or his staff. Now, all this stuff eventually is going to come out. In this city, of course, it always does. There will eventually be a day of reckoning. But Mr. Horowitz, I realize that the intel community is not within your jurisdiction. I get that, but you have vast experience. And so based on your experience overall, have you ever seen a case similar to this where there is an anonymous complaint with no firsthand information against the president by an individual who's having communications with the staff of the other political party?
I'm not aware of a case other than this one personally on those facts, but just to be clear, we get anonymous complaints all the time on our
Yeah, but
hotline.
this one in particular, like this, and I want to keep going because
I don't have any particular knowledge.
Okay, I didn't think you would. Again, relying on your experience, are you familiar with any federal law that would grant anonymity to this individual? given the circumstances here?
The IG Act requires us as IGs to protect the identity of individuals who come to us absent very limited circumstances. So anybody who comes to an IG, we're going to be in a situation of protecting the identity.
Okay, it's my understanding that the IG, the Intel IG, is to protect not to disclose the identity, but I'm not familiar with any statute that would guarantee that.
No, the IG Act doesn't have a 100% guarantee in it.
Okay.
It has a limited exception in there. For example, we face this when there's a court order and a subpoena of some sort that would require someone to testify in court. That would be then up to a judge to decide how to proceed.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent to put into the record an article from Washington Post that deals with this whole issue.
Without objection.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California for her 5 minutes, Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. At the outset, I would like to submit an open letter to the American people signed by former inspector generals who are interested in making sure that all Americans can be guaranteed safety, and that's what whistleblowers provide.
Without objection, it will be entered into the record.
Thank you. The Inspector General of the intelligence community testified before the Intelligence Committee that he had investigated the complaint, found it to be credible and urgent. That was then sent to the Director of National Intelligence, who decided not to do what the law requires, which is to automatically send it to the committees of jurisdiction, the intelligence committees of both houses, but to tell the White House. So I guess my question to any one of you is, what do we have to do within that particular law to make sure that the intelligence committees get access to complaints that are filed that are deemed to be both urgent and credible?
I can take this question. I think it's important to remove some of those steps in between. So I think it should be possible for the Inspector General of the intelligence community to transmit those credible complaints of urgent concern directly to the committees of jurisdiction rather than go through the Director of National Intelligence, for starters.
So historically, they always have been sent to the committees, even when they weren't found to be credible or urgent. So this was a divergence that took place that frankly smacks of political interest, does it not? You don't have to answer that. Mr. Fine, you know in your written statement that there's a small but disturbing trend and call to account DoD managers that have failed to take action even after your office has substantiated claims of reprisal having taken place. I'm disheartened to hear about the results of the Leidos case, in which a subcontractor employee reported about sexual harassment. Your office provided an investigative report recommending compensatory damages, and the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment disagreed without real explanation. Why do we spend taxpayer money empowering you to do investigations, to substantiate complaints? You make recommendations, and then the agency can decline to move forward with the investigation and the results that you have come up with.
Well, that's the scheme, that's the legislation that has been created, that we are not the final arbiters of that. We're the investigators. We did do a full investigation. We provided the reasons why, a detailed analysis about why we thought it was substantiated. It took us a long time to get a response from the department. When we did get a response, it was not very detailed or thorough or persuasive. We pushed back, and eventually we got the ultimate decision by the Undersecretary. We then came to Congress and notified you of that, because the power that we have is the power of the spotlight. We shine a spotlight on this, and we do think it is important that the components, the agencies, take action. We're not infallible. We're not always right, but we try to explain why we reached our conclusions, and we think the department ought to do the same thing and take appropriate action. It is a disturbing trend. I point out in my testimony that there are at least 2 other cases where the same thing happened. They declined to take action in a substantiated case without providing detailed or persuasive reasons why. That is a disturbing trend, and we think that a spotlight ought to be shined on that, and questions ought to be asked about that.
Well, beyond the spotlight, what would you recommend? Maybe you should take this as a request that you can respond to the full committee. What kind of changes would you like to see in the law so that this discretion isn't such that the facts that are verified and your recommendations are made and people are denied justice?
Well, the Senate Armed Service Committee in the NDAA, a conference report to the NDAA, required that both we and the IG for the Department of Homeland Security put in our semi-annual reports any time that happens or that the department has not responded in a timely way. So I think transparency is an important thing. I don't think we ought to be the final arbiters. We're not judge and jury, but we ought to provide transparency on when this happens, and then people ought to be asked about this. I mean, hearings are good, questions are good, and I think that can have a positive impact as well.
Thank you, Mr. Fine. Gentlelady's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Because I used Mr. Meadows' time, I'm going to yield to my 5 minutes to Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Jordan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Thank the chairman. Ms. Hempelwitz, in your closing statement, closing part of your opening statement, you said, some have argued inaccurately that the recent Ukraine whistleblower improperly colluded with the House Intelligence Committee. Some have argued inaccurately. How do you know that the argument's not accurate?
Well, I base that simply on what's been said by the acting director of national intelligence and the intelligence community inspector general, as well as the whistleblowers' attorneys who say that this individual is followed.
But I mean, you have no knowledge. You didn't talk to Chairman Schiff. Have you talked to Chairman Schiff about it?
No, sir.
Did you talk to his staff about the interaction they had with the whistleblower?
No, sir.
Did you talk to the ICIG about the interaction he had with the whistleblower?
No, sir, but I will say the committee staff did also say that they have talked publicly about what
But you made a blanket statement. You said some have argued inaccurately. We have no idea what took place between the whistleblower and Chairman Schiff's staff, and yet you come in front of the Oversight Committee on a hearing on whistleblowers, and you say some have argued inaccurately that the recent Ukraine whistleblower improperly colluded with the House Intelligence Committee. We have no idea.
Well, sir, I'm not quite sure what improper collusion would look like in that aspect, because the intelligence community whistleblower would be able to go to the committee and make their disclosure under the law. So I'm not quite sure what they could have done that would have been improper.
Well, we know the chairman thought that when he was first asked about it, he thought it was better off to say something that wasn't accurate, namely that his staff had no contact with the whistleblower, only to have to correct that a few days later and say, whoops, we actually did. So for some reason, he was willing to hide it, and yet you come here and say there was nothing done improperly, and you've not talked to any of the people who participated. And frankly, none of us have. No one in the country has. And I've got a chance to look at a little bit of the ICIG's testimony. It's interesting that Chairman Schiff has failed to release the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community's testimony. He did have a chance to go through and look at all this, but Chairman Schiff interviewed 18 people. He's released 17 transcripts of those 18 people that he interviewed in this impeachment inquiry, but not the Inspector General. You go on to say this, before making their disclosure, and that the, quote, whistleblower reported bias against the president undermined the disclosure. So bias doesn't matter?
According to Congress, no. You guys updated the law in 2012 to say that motive couldn't be considered a factor that would undermine whistleblower protection.
Bias
That's because the facts matter more.
Well, as far as whistleblower protection goes, I get that. But motive always matters. When you're evaluating the claim of anybody, you always have to look at bias and motive. And yet, again, you come in front of the Oversight Committee today on a hearing about whistleblowers, and you say bias doesn't matter, particularly bias against the President of the United States in an impeachment proceeding doesn't matter?
It certainly doesn't matter more than the facts, and I believe that most of the facts alleged in the underlying complaint have been corroborated.
Actually, there are all kinds of things that the whistleblower got wrong in the complaint because, again, as Mr. Heiss pointed out, the whistleblower had no firsthand knowledge. Do you know do you know, Ms. Hempelwitz, seem to be an expert on all this, do you know if we ever, in the impeachment inquiry in the House, do you know if we talked to any of the people who did have firsthand knowledge?
I think you have not, and I think mostly because they have refused to come before the committee.
No, I'm talking about the people the whistleblower alleges in his complaint. Bullet point number 1, the whistleblower's complaint, he says this: over the past 4 months, more than half a dozen U.S. officials have informed me about the complaint. Do you know who those more than half a dozen U.S. officials are?
No, sir.
I don't either. No one knows because guess what? We didn't get to talk to the whistleblower. The whistleblower who is biased and the whistleblower who met with Adam Schiff's staff, and then Adam Schiff said, no, he didn't, only later to have to correct that and say, well, yes, he did. And remember what else Mr. Schiff said about the whistleblower. Early on in this process, back in September, guess what Adam Schiff said? We look forward to hearing from the whistleblower. Remember that?
I believe that's when the whistleblower wanted to testify publicly.
That's when we all wanted to hear from the whistleblower, including Adam Schiff, but suddenly that changed when Adam Schiff made the other statement that they hadn't talked to, that his staff had not met with him, when in fact they had. I just find it amazing that you can say some have argued inaccurately that the recent whistleblower improperly colluded with the House Intelligence Committee, and you have no knowledge whether it was accurate or not, whether they colluded or not. Sure looks like they did, particularly when, in light of the fact that the chairman tried to hide the fact that they met in the first place.
Again, I'm just not quite sure what could be improper about those conversations. And so it's difficult for me to imagine what could have gone on, but I can't speak to why Chairman Schiff said what he said. Like I said earlier, I have not spoken with him.
I thank the chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I want to thank you and all of our colleagues for your indulgence. I'm chairing another hearing right now, and so let me proceed quickly. Ms. Hempowitz, let me come quickly to you, because you're with the Project on Government Oversight, which represents whistleblowers who are blowing the whistle on waste and fraud and abuse, governmental corruption, waste of the taxpayers' money. Is that right?
We advocate for whistleblowers. We don't represent them.
You advocate
but we
for
advocate for them.
Okay. So in other words, you would not represent them in court, but you advocate for their interests and to protect them. Why do people get so mad about whistleblowers? Why are people so upset about whistleblowers?
I'm not quite sure. Honestly, I think whistleblowers are patriots who are doing what all federal employees take an oath to do, which is to uphold the laws of our country. And whistleblowers come forward when they see that those laws, rules, and regulations are not being upheld. So I don't know how to answer your question, but I'm probably not the right person to ask that.
Well, we have had to legislate to protect whistleblowers in the past because they often irritate people. People get mad at them. There are powerful interests that come down hard on them. Mr. Calapenta, let me ask you, what's going on when people get incensed and irate about whistleblowers?
Nobody likes a rat. That was the name of a title of another academic study that created a whistleblowing game, and what they found out was that even amongst people who were honest in a group, once the whistleblower's identity became known, that they had blown the whistle, the members of the honest group shunned that person. It is part of human nature that if your integrity or your ethics are attacked or your political position is attacked, people will circle the wagons and they will strike out and create intimidation. And that's what happens with whistleblowing.
No, that's fascinating. You're telling me as a matter of social psychology and empirical documentation, you're saying that even when a whistleblower comes forward to tell the truth and the revelations and the disclosures are proven to be true and say they saved the government millions of dollars or they blow the whistle on a criminal scheme or corruption, still people are mad at them for what they did?
Yes, because what is going on is a person is raising an issue of importance that may impinge on budgets, it may embarrass the department, and people don't want to be associated with that because whistleblowing is known to be a stigma and is career limiting.
Okay, so why is it that in the strong democracies on earth we've adopted whistleblower protections? What is the social function played by protections of the whistleblowers?
Because we want to save taxpayers' money. We want government to be efficient. We want to combat government waste. We want to combat fraud. And in the final analysis, nobody really wants to work for a crook or to have a government that's inefficient and wastes taxpayer money.
Well, what are the major gaps that still exist in federal statutory protections for whistleblowers now? If you could write a new statute to fill it in, what are the major areas that you would target?
Well, there are three things, as I mentioned in my opening statement, was that, I would recommend and suggest increasing confidentiality to allow people to bring an action if their confidentiality or privacy is breached after they were guaranteed confidentiality under the statute. The second thing...
Let me pause you right there, because there's a big attack on confidentiality of whistleblowers right now, saying we want to out the whistleblowers, we want to hold them up to the light, and so on. Explain why whistleblowers should have confidentiality and how that doesn't endanger anybody else's due process.
Because what it does is that it provides a safe channel. Any organization, whether it's a corporation or the government in a large department, should be encouraging whistleblowing. It makes them more effective, it makes them more efficient. And by making it confidential, you eliminate that stigma, hopefully, unless the person has gone internal first and is widely known or is fingerprinted.
Well, why would somebody want to maintain their confidentiality if they're blowing the whistle on corporate corruption or child sexual abuse or someone stealing money?
Because the track record has shown that people lose their careers.
Thank you, Mr. Colapinto. Gentleman's time has expired, but I thank him for coming from his hearing to this important hearing. Gentleman, the other gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we all know by now the FBI doctored an email to get a FISA warrant in order to spy on the Trump campaign, and that's what I want to address. Mr. Horowitz, last month in an exchange with Senator Lee, you testified you couldn't rule out political bias contributing to surveilling Trump campaign associates. You testified, and I quote, "We were not in a position with the evidence we had to make that conclusion, but I'm not ruling it out," unquote. I want to go over a few of those biased messages this FBI lawyer texted when candidate Trump was elected, right after the election. Quote, I'm so stressed about what I could have done differently. Next quote, I just can't imagine the systematic disassembly of the progress we made over the last 8 years. Next quote, the crazies finally won. Next quote, this is the Tea Party on steroids. Next quote, the GOP is going to be lost. They have to deal with an incumbent in 4 years. Next quote, we have to fight this again. And the last quote from the lawyer with the FBI, quote, Pence is stupid. Now, he also texted someone else, vive la resistance. Of course, that's French for long live the resistance. He texted that a few weeks after Donald Trump was elected president. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Are you aware this FBI lawyer interviewed another Trump campaign associate, not just Carter Page?
As I sit here, I don't recall that person interviewing.
This lawyer also interviewed George Papadopoulos. Now, are you reviewing other legislative steps this lawyer has taken?
So the FISA court issued an order ordering the department to do that. We're obviously following up on our report and are watching their responses both to the court and to us.
Mm-hmm. Do you know if Attorney John Durham is looking into this FBI lawyer?
I have a general understanding of what Mr. Durham's working on, but I direct you to him.
So did you speak with John Durham about this FBI lawyer?
We referred the matter to the Attorney General per the IG Act for his handling.
So tell me, can you tell us anything you two discussed, even if it's in general terms?
I'm not going to get into discussions that I had with Mr. Durham. We had some general discussions along the way about the substance of our report, about generally his work, but I'd ask you to go to him to inquire about any referrals that he may be handling.
Okay. Inspector General, you testified last month this FBI lawyer doctored an email to support a probable cause against Trump's campaign associate, Carter Page. You also testified Carter Page, the Trump campaign associate, and I quote, "I do not think the Department of Justice fairly treated these FISAs," and he, referring to Carter Page, I believe, was on the receiving end, end quote. Is that correct?
That, I recall generally that testimony, yes.
If you were a target of a FISA warrant, after everything you uncovered, if you were a target, would you trust the team the FBI assembled in the Carter Page investigation? Would you trust that you would be given a fair shake?
I hope I wasn't the target of the FISA.
Well, don't we all?
Certainly this team that handled this FISA did not do what they were supposed to do. The rules were clear. They didn't follow the rules. And so I think it's appropriate what the court is looking at here to see what other matters they worked on.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Horowitz, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for this timely hearing on whistleblowers. I do want to note that the ranking member of the full committee spoke of the bias of the whistleblower, even though ultimately witnesses came forward and essentially proved that what the whistleblower had alleged concerning the president was true. So I don't understand that any bias was ever found. The opposite seems to me to have been found. I'm interested in the roles of the multiple whistleblowers. The whistleblower can apparently speak to an inspector general, speak to the Office of Special Counsel, to the Merit Systems Protection Board. So I see a scenario where there could be some confusion as to where to go. Mr. Horowitz, is there any role for the Office of Inspector General in overseeing the whistleblower investigations reported to the IG offices?
I'm sorry, could you say that again, Congresswoman?
Given the multiple places that a whistleblower can go to, I'm asking, is there any role for your office, the Office of Inspector General, in overseeing the whistleblower investigations reported to various IG offices?
So as chair of the Council of IGs, what we have tried to do is a couple things. One, set up the whistleblower page I mentioned earlier on oversight.gov that provides information on where whistleblowers can go, because it can be, as you said, confusing where to report it. We also formed a working group in 2015, shortly after I became chair. So we are getting together regularly with all of the whistleblower protection coordinators in the IG community to share best practices, and so that we can talk with one another about what we're each finding, challenges from our agency, challenges within our work.
I just wish if you found your way to anybody, that would be regarded as done. So the jurisdictional questions wouldn't matter. The point is to encourage whistleblowing. Mr. Fine, I have here a report of the GAO, and I want to quote from, it's just a sentence. The General Accounting Office found that the Office of Management and Budget withheld from obligation funds appropriated to the Department of Defense for security assistance to Ukraine. What is the role of the Department of Defense Inspector General in investigating such a withholding?
So that relates to the whole Ukrainian matter, and we were asked by several senators to get involved, and what we discussed it with our colleagues at Justice and the State Department, and decided that in light of the inquiry by the House and the impeachment inquiry and even the trial by the Senate, it would not be appropriate for the IGs to, at this point, investigate those matters, because it would overlap, duplicate, and potentially interfere with that very important inquiry. We have an obligation to make sure that we do not do that.
Overlap with who, what? Interfere with
Well,
what?
there's similar witnesses, potentially similar witnesses, and we do not want to be interviewing witnesses that perhaps the House wanted to interview or that potentially could be part of the trial. It's the same principle we apply when there's a criminal case ongoing. We would not open an investigation and interfere with that, and would defer to that. Now, I know that impeachment is not a criminal matter, but it is not a usual congressional inquiry. So we responded to the senators saying we declined to open an investigation at this time, but down the road, if there's things that needed to be reviewed, we would consider it at that point.
I should certainly hope that at some point, when this matter is straightened out, we could learn whether the IG at the Department of Defense has a Merit System Protection Board. Now, they don't have a quorum. And it looks like they haven't had a quorum for a while. Mr. Hempowitz, what happens when federal employees do not have access to the MSBP or to any enforcement mechanism?
Unfortunately, what happens is they're in administrative bureaucratic limbo.
How long has it been that MSNBC has not had a quorum?
3 years, almost 3 years.
So there's been no enforcement whatsoever?
No, ma'am, there's a case backlog of 2,500 cases right now.
I don't know if there's anything we can do, Mr. Chairman.
Well, as I indicated earlier, as you know, Ms. Norton, Mr. Cummings, the late Mr. Cummings and I have a bill that would at least allow some administrative action by the attorney until there's a board member confirmed, so that we eat into that backlog and we protect whistleblowers. That bill passed this committee unanimously on a voice vote, and we're waiting for some floor action. So any help you can provide with your influence would be great.
And can I make one suggestion?
Yes, please.
I think even beyond restoring the quorum to the MSPB, it's vital to give whistleblowers the right.
Lynch is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the...
You get 5 more minutes?
Yep.
Please forgive me, Mr. Lynch.
I will yield.
I thought Mr. Jordan had used his 5 minutes.
I used
And
Massey's.
Mr. Kelly, as soon as we're finished, we'll come to you. Thank you, Mr. Jordan.
I thank the chairman. Mr. Horowitz, was Carter Page an operational contact for another federal agency?
He was.
Did the Department of Justice tell that? Did the Department of Justice and the FBI tell that to the FISA court when they went to get the FISA application on Mr. Page?
They did not.
They did not. Did an FBI lawyer doctor an email that was part of the FISA application to get this warrant on Carter Page?
Doctored an email that went to the affiant who swore out the FISA application.
Yeah.
The email itself wasn't part of the application.
Understand, but, and the way it was doctored was not just doctored, they directly changed. It said it went from Carter Page was a source to Carter Page was not a source. Is that right?
Correct.
Directly the opposite meaning. And that became part of the basis to go to the court and get the warrant on Carter Page.
That was relied upon by the FBI agent who swore out the...
Now, I've seen correspondence between Christopher Steele, the guy who wrote the dossier that was taken to the court, correspondence between him and the Department of Justice, where he indicated to them that, to the Department of Justice, that he was desperate to stop Trump from becoming president. Did that get communicated to the FISA court when they were getting the warrant to spy on Carter Page?
It did not. He relayed that to Bruce Orr, who relayed it to the FBI.
Yep. I also know that the Clinton campaign paid the law firm Perkins Coie, who hired Fusion GPS, who hired Mr. Steele, who actually put together the dossier, as we just said. Did the fact that the Clinton campaign was paying for this operation, this dossier, did that get communicated to the FISA court?
That information did not.
Did not get communicated to the FISA court. How many false or misleading communications were made to the FISA court relative to the Carter Page?
We identified 17 significant omissions or inaccuracies in the report. That's not all of them. That's the 17 we thought were the most material.
So more than 17 times they misled the court.
We identified a bunch of instances of inaccuracies. I think I'd leave it to others to decide and the court to decide what was misleading or not to the court.
January 29, 2018, 2 years ago, Chairman of the House Intel Committee, Chairman Schiff, said that the FBI and DOJ officials did not abuse the FISA process. Is that an accurate statement, Mr. Horowitz?
Well, the department has submitted a letter to the court now that has been made public, where the department has determined that the last 2 FISAs at a minimum did not have and did not support probable cause.
Mr. Schiff also said on January 29, 2018, that the DOJ and FBI, quote, made only narrow use of information from Christopher Steele's sources about Carter Page's specific activities in 2016. Is that accurate?
I don't know the specific wording of what was said there, but as we reported, we found that the dossier, that the Steele reporting was central and essential to the application for the initial FISA and to the subsequent FISA.
I think you said on December 11th in front of the Senate that FBI's FISA applications relied entirely on Steele's and his primary subsource reporting to make allegations against Mr. Page.
Just to add, it was to be precise, for the purpose of connecting Carter Page.
What's up, Snafu? Snafu's in the house. Y'all check out Snafu Snaps. Click on his little thing. Look at his YouTube channel. Go to snafusnaps.com. Now my internet's going crazy, of course. What's up, dude? Thanks for joining. Hi.
Alleged activities, Carter Page's alleged activities to Russia, to the Trump campaign. There was other information in there concerning Mr. Page not connected to the Trump campaign.
Did the FBI corroborate the allegations against Mr. Page?
The allegations in the FISA about his purported serving as an intermediary between Russia and the Trump campaign, they did not substantiate.
So again, 2 years ago on January 29, 2018, when Adam Schiff said Department of Justice provided additional information obtained through multiple independent sources that corroborated Steele's reporting, that would be inaccurate as well.
As we noted in the report, they provided some information, mostly from public sourcing, that they found corroborated the reporting. What they did not find was corroboration for the allegations linking Mr. Page to Russia, to the Trump campaign.
Finally, let me ask this. Also 2 years ago, Mr. Schiff said the Department of Justice met the rigor, transparency, and evidentiary basis needed to meet FISA's probable cause requirement. Is that an accurate statement?
Given the nature and the number of omissions and inaccuracies in there, we certainly didn't characterize what they had done as following the rules or complying with the rigor that's required of a FISA application.
You not only didn't characterize it in the way Mr. Schiff portrayed it 2 years ago and stated in his memo, you said this: the IG report found 51 factual assertions in Carter Page's FISA applications that, quote, had no supporting documentation, supporting document doesn't state fact, or supporting document shows factual assertion is inaccurate. Is that right?
And that's my reference before to at least 17. There were many others that we have in our appendix that are supposed to be followed through the Woods procedures, which is the factual accuracy review, that were not there. Some are significant, some are not as significant, but there shouldn't be any.
One last question. Are there any other reports coming? What are you working on right now in this area?
Yeah,
So
we are doing a follow-up audit because one of the questions we had coming away from this was, did this happen only in this case?
Yep.
Or does the failures we heard about in the Woods procedures and that we saw in the Woods procedures infect other counterintelligence FISAs and something we hadn't looked at, counterterrorism-related FISAs? And so
can you give us a little preview of what you may be finding and when that report may be?
Thank you, Mr. Horowitz. Gentleman's time is expired. Mr. Lynch, I'm worried about the clock because votes have been called.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I want to thank all the witnesses for your helping the committee with its work. Mr. Horowitz, have you ever seen a situation where the President and members of Congress openly and aggressively attack a whistleblower, like we have with the Ukraine whistleblower?
I can't say I personally.
Yeah. Anybody else on the panel? Ever see anybody, a whistleblower attacked, especially after the report of the phone call was basically corroborated, remember? Anybody ever see a situation like that where a whistleblower was attacked by members of Congress who were supposed to be the recipients of intelligence and information from a whistleblower? Anybody ever see anything like that happen? Me neither. Ms. Hempowitz?
I would say not like this.
Not like this, right. So what do you think the effect on other whistleblowers will be if this whistleblower, who basically got based on the transcript, got it right? There's, under the Whistleblower Protection Act, if you see any evidence of misconduct, waste, fraud, or abuse of power, you're supposed to report that. And by all the evidence, it appears that this whistleblower, in fact, did just that. And then, in return for that whistleblower speaking out at great risk to themselves, they get attacked by the President, who on September 26th said that this whistleblower was akin to a traitor and a spy and should be treated as we used to treat traitors and spies. What kind of effect do you think that'll have on whistleblowers, Ms. Hempowitz?
I would say it's certainly going to chill others from coming forward, especially in the intelligence community where it's already almost impossible to enforce their legal protections.
Mr. Horowitz, you've been up before this committee. You're a frequent flyer here, and you do some amazing work. I give you great credit. What do you think that would, on the minds of other federal employees, who are being asked to report misconduct? And it appears, based on the evidence, based on the transcript, that there certainly was some evidence there of abuse of power. He didn't have, remember, a whistleblower doesn't have to prove the case. He just raises his hand and says, something is not right here, and I'm reporting this, and I want this looked at. So when a whistleblower does that, and then members of Congress, the president, likens that person to a traitor and a spy and suggests that that person should be treated as a traitor or a spy like we used to do in the old days when they were shot, what do you think that impact has on a potential whistleblower out there who observes misconduct within the government?
Look, individuals who step forward and report wrongdoing or what they reasonably believe to be wrongdoing should not face even the threat of retaliation.
Right.
We want people to come forward. It's then our job as IGs and others who investigate this to assess whether the information is supported. But you don't want to attack, and you shouldn't be attacking the person who brings that forward. They may be right, they may not be right, but that's for us to assess, not to attack the people who come forward.
If now we have a situation where members of Congress, who again are going to be the recipients of this intelligence, to protect the public trust, to protect the taxpayer, to protect our government, if we in turn attack the whistleblower for reporting misconduct, should there not be penalties on us for violating the law? Public officials who go for revenge, and I'll ask you, Ms. Hempowitz. I mean, you're an advocate for functioning whistleblowers within government. Oftentimes, these departments are so densely controlled, and they're so distant from the public and from the rest of Congress. We are at a loss. We can't drill down and find out what some of these agencies, they're tens of thousands of employees, we can't figure out what everybody's doing, so we rely on this self-reporting. I mean, should we protect those individuals from retaliation from Congress as well?
Absolutely, and I would also add that the White House isn't covered by the whistleblower protection statutes, and so it should extend to them as well.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lynch. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Yeah, Mr. Horowitz, just because over the years we've asked you tons of questions, I'm comfortable with you. I'll ask you some more questions. You testified last month, and I'll quote, "I do not think the Department of Justice fairly treated these FISAs," and Carter Page was on the receiving end. Okay, is that true?
I recall that.
Yeah. You also found several major issues with an FBI case agent who was investigating Carter Page's investigation. We'll call him case agent number 1. I just wanted to go over a few of them. Case agent number 1 never shared with the Justice Department information that showed Carter Page was innocent. For instance, he never met Paul Manafort. He told you he couldn't recall why that happened, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Case agent number 1 wrote that Christopher Steele, the source for Carter Page's FISA, that Steele's work was previously used in criminal proceedings when that wasn't true and contradicted Steele's FBI handler, correct?
They never shared it with the FBI handling agent, who said that he thought it wasn't fully accurate.
Okay. Case agent number 1 did not share with the Justice Department information that showed Papadopoulos, another campaign associate, of being innocent. Case agent number 1 just said it may have been an oversight, correct?
There were interactions by FBI confidential human source with Mr. Papadopoulos, where Mr. Papadopoulos made statements that were inconsistent with the allegations in the FISA, and that information was not shared as it should have been with the Justice Department.
Okay. How can you miss something that important on an investigation as sensitive as looking into a presidential candidate? Don't you think that's odd?
That was our concern with the explanations we received, why we noted in our report that we didn't find those explanations convincing in the least.
Okay, again, with regard to Case Agent 1, who was in charge of putting together the Woods file for accuracy, you found 51 errors in his Woods file verification, right?
That's correct.
Kind of scary, isn't it?
Yes.
Real scary. Quoting right from your report again, quote, Case Agent 1 provided the DOJ attorney with inaccurate information that failed to disclose the extent and nature of Page's relationship with that agency, end quote. Correct?
Neither that case agent or anybody at the FBI shared with the Justice Department the information that Mr. Page had been previously in operational contact for another government agency.
Isn't that kind of scary? Kind of leads one not to trust the government, doesn't it?
That information came to the FBI in August of 2016, well before any of the FISA applications, and it should have prompted interactions with the other government agency to understand the nature of that relationship and how it might have impacted going forward with any FISA.
It's sad, isn't it? It makes one not surprised at all why on all levels of our government there's not trust in our government, right?
It certainly creates the very deep concern about authorities like FISA, the use of those authorities, and I think that's why you see some of the orders coming from the FISA court now.
Okay, I'm almost out of time. Case Agent 1 was actually promoted in the middle of the investigation, right?
Case Agent 1 was promoted during the course of the investigation.
I know. Well, another case agent took over day-to-day, and this new case agent questioned if it was prudent to renew the FISA warrant on Carter Page, but got overruled by Case Agent 1, correct?
Two agents spoke about, as we related in the report, why not only was the FISA going forward, but why Mr. Page was even still a subject of the investigation. It's not clear to us who made the ultimate decision to nevertheless go forward with the next FISA renewal.
Okay. You didn't name Case Agent 1 in your report, but could you at least tell us, did this guy's boss know what he did?
So Case Agent 1's supervisor, who was a supervisory special agent, was responsible for double-checking and following up on the Woods process where all of those errors were located, and that supervisory special agent also did not do their job in following up and identifying those issues.
Does the FBI director, Ray, does he know who this is? Agent is?
Yes, he does.
And does the Attorney General know?
I believe he does, yes.
Okay. What did Director Ray say to you about this case agent? Did he say anything to you about him? Or her?
Director Ray was very concerned about, frankly, the activity for all of the individuals who had responsibilities and didn't conform to what they are required to do under FBI procedures.
Is he still at his promoted position?
I don't know as I sit.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for giving me the extra time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Mr. Horowitz. Mr. Armstrong, you are recognized for 5 minutes. I caution you that votes have been called and time has expired, but there are still 232 who have not voted, and you and I are the two among them.
I would say you can go first because I would do this, but thank you, and I appreciate your indulgence for letting me sit in on this. I would point out a couple things. One, in the whistleblower statute, there's the right to protect them to remain anonymous, and there's also the point to protect them from retaliation. And the reason for that is in various different scenarios, such as a criminal investigation and charges being born out of that. There is ways, there are even civil cases that they would be subpoenaed or have to appear in court. Also, sometimes they're disclosed before they're ever protected. So if we're going to continue to talk about a trial and a fairness of a trial and calling witnesses, one of the fundamental issues for a trial, any trial, civil or criminal, is the right to confront your accuser. Also, we seem to think that there is this bifurcation of either the whistleblower doesn't testify or he comes into open hearing in front of the Senate. As somebody who's done this my whole life, there are significant safeguards that exist in between those two spectrums. So to say that that is a binary choice is patently false. And this isn't some retaliation within some agency or somewhere else. We're talking about the impeachment of a duly elected president. But Mr. Horowitz, I've read your reports, and I want to take you back to June of 2018 when the Clinton email server or investigation report came out. And in that report, FBI officials involved sent messages on their FBI devices that created the appearance of political bias, and this was Strzok and Page, correct?
Among others.
Yeah. And you did not have confidence that Strzok's decisions at the end of the 2016 presidential campaign to prioritize Trump-Russia over the new Clinton emails was free from bias, and that he and other FBI employers brought discredit to themselves and hurt the FBI's reputation?
That was our finding.
Yeah. And you also sharply criticized Director Comey for his public statements about the Clinton email case, when he wouldn't recommend charges, and then in October of 2016, he told Congress new emails were found, right?
That's correct.
And he usurped the authority of the Attorney General, chose to deviate from established procedures, engaged in his own ad hoc decision-making, and you concluded that following established procedures are most important when the stakes are the highest, correct?
That's correct.
But yet, the final report said this report did not find any evidence of political bias or improper consideration actually impacting the investigations.
We found that the decisions that were made by the prosecutors not to prosecute and some of the other decisions we looked at were not impacted by bias.
And in your newest report, you said the Justice Department failed to interview key figures or vet critical information and sources in the Steele dossier. They wouldn't interview campaign officials because they feared that they were compromised, but at the same time, CIA Director Brennan had told the Russians directly. So the Russians knew about the investigation, but the Trump campaign didn't, correct?
Frankly, I don't know what Mr. Brennan has said he spoke to the Russians about.
And the CIA told the FBI that Carter Page was working for them.
I'm not sure.
But the FBI never disclosed that to the FISA court.
I'm sorry. Could you ask?
FBI never disclosed that Carter Page was working for the CIA to the FISA court.
I can't talk about anything other than what's in my report at this point, because anything else would be classified.
Did the DOJ determine that there was no probable cause for a FISA warrant on Page?
The DOJ recently, on the day we released our report, sent a letter to the FISA court saying that at least as with regard to the final two renewal applications, they concluded there was insufficient evidence to support the probable cause.
Was there an intervention from the highest levels of the FBI in ordering agents to look at the Steele dossier?
When the dossier came in, the discussions subsequent to that in advance of the FISA went all the way up to the leadership of the FBI, and they were aware of the fact of the Steele reporting and the decision to rely on it.
And the FBI, and that was actually Andy McCabe, right? Correct?
Mr. McCabe was involved in those discussions, and as we lay out in connection with the discussions with the intelligence community assessment, both Mr. McCabe and Mr. Comey had discussions with their counterparts about including the Steele reporting in the ICA.
Okay. And the FBI affirmed that Steele was viewed as a reliable witness, even though they knew in previous instances he had not been reliable, right?
The FBI laid out in their application why they found him to be reliable, but did not go to the handling agent to look at that statement, which the handling agent told us was not fully accurate.
So what they knew and what was put in the FISA warrant were two different things. And in order to keep the investigation into President Trump's campaign going, the FBI lied and omitted key information from the FISA court, and with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for his assertion. It is now the chairman's time to ask questions. And I'm going to deal with you, Mr. Rosenzweig. I know, because you look bored. And it's
Not bored, Your Honor.
It's only fair. Somebody said, well, the whistleblower has a bias. Let me ask you this question. If someone's biased, does it mean that what they say is untrue?
No.
No. So Ms. Hemperwood's saying, frankly, that's interesting but irrelevant. Is correct.
Is not bias or motive of the witness. It's whether or not what they say is corroborated by other evidence.
Thank you.
I did defense.
What?
Sorry.
I did defense.
Oh, sorry. I do that now.
So here's another one. It wasn't firsthand knowledge. So if we required all whistleblowers to have firsthand knowledge, I dare say there wouldn't be many whistleblowers left.
We'd have very few.
Very few. Is there something in law or even standard practice that requires a whistleblower who comes forward to only produce firsthand knowledge, or we dismiss them?
No, in fact, in most instances, they rely on secondhand knowledge, as does every human being in their everyday life.
So all of a sudden, we have a new standard that crops up because we don't like the content of what the whistleblower has to say about the President of the United States. He or she didn't have firsthand knowledge. And that's a new standard that would jeopardize whistleblowing in the federal government, period. Would that be a fair thing to say, Mr. Rosenweig?
I would be very concerned if we threw the baby out with the bathwater and wound up after the current controversy in a situation where there were fewer whistleblowers who were disincentivized from coming forward.
And by the way, I think Mr. Colapinto talked about nobody likes a rat, which is kind of an unfortunate turn of phrase. But the fact of the matter is, often whistleblowers might come in different packages, sizes, designs, and characters, not all of which are appealing. That doesn't mean their testimony is in fact invalid. However unpopular or unappealing they may be as a personality.
In criminal law, we call them confidential informants. In intelligence, we call them sources. In whistleblower law, we call them rats.
Okay, final for me. No, I have one more. Motive matters, Mr. Jordan said. Motive matters, meaning if I don't like the motive, the testimony of the whistleblower in question is discounted, is invalidated. Look, I may have the darkest, meanest motive in the world. It doesn't, per se, discredit my testimony. Is that correct?
It's correct. It means we should look at it and carefully and determine whether it's true. But
and whistleblowers are not necessarily witnesses at a trial. They're sources of information upon which we act. Is that fair, Mr. Horowitz?
That's correct.
So when somebody says the president, for example, is entitled to this notion that I get to face my accuser, well, it's not quite the right analogy. We're not in that situation. The whistleblower is a source upon which others may act to determine veracity of questions. Is that correct?
When you're dealing with that kind of information, whether you're a prosecutor, an IG, or whomever, you're trying to corroborate and go from there. It doesn't necessarily mean that the whistleblower becomes a witness.
Right. We have to go vote. I rest my case. There's been nothing but red herrings about the whistleblower, and what bothers me, I'll end on this note, is the threat to disclose the identity of the whistleblower. Let me tell you, if that happens because of who the whistleblower was talking about, we have jeopardized the entire protection of every whistleblower going forward, and I find that unbelievable hypocrisy when this Congress and previous Congresses on a bipartisan basis have spent years talking sanctimoniously about protecting whistleblowers. Well, it's the hard cases that require the protection, not the easy ones. I thank you all so much for coming today. And we have some items without objection to enter into the record. Members have 5 more days to submit written questions through the chair to our witnesses, and I have a great day. This hearing is adjourned.
Sorry.
All right, so thank you for bearing with me so much, and thanks for stopping in, Snafu Snaps. I think he's gone now. He probably went on to something else. Supports a lot of people just like I do, so he pops in and out, you know. And thank you for joining a person. I like how descriptive your name is. You are a person. Welcome. Hello, person. You know, I really like how at the end he was hammering home that point that motive doesn't really change fact. You know, I'm all about information here, and when right before the election, the past election, when they came out with the emails about Hillary and stuff, and they were like, oh, well, they shouldn't have opened the investigation again, blah, blah, blah. I was like, nah, man, I don't care if it's right before the election. Information to the people. That's what I'm about. And it's the same thing now. I don't care that there's an election coming up. If there's information that needs to come out regarding Trump, then let it come out. I'm all about that information. So, hopefully it doesn't switch over to something else. Okay, good, it's paused. Alright, so we are going to now switch back over to the impeachment trial fun stuff that's going on. If it is still going on. Thank you guys so much for bearing with me switching over to that. I really felt like it was important, especially as I kind of view myself as a truther, and a lot of the other channels and stuff that I like to follow view themselves as truthers, and are they not up and going anymore? Oh, well, I guess they finished, maybe. So I guess we'll just end the stream here. And if they start back up again, but I don't think they will, because usually they will just have it on pause. Huh. Alrighty then. Okay, well, I guess they are done for the day. I'm not really surprised. I mean, they were saying that, you know, they don't really need to give that much of a defense of Mr. Donald Trump because, you know, they view that he didn't do anything wrong. And so they went over a lot of, yeah, so tomorrow is when they're going to reconvene. They went over a lot of some of the history of our country and why our founding fathers would have done this or that, and agreed with Mr. Trump's actions. And as I've said before, I don't like Trump. I don't tend to like people that are all about fiat currency, and he is all about that, so I don't particularly like him. But I do think that he was when he said, I want you to do us a favor, though, I think he was speaking off the cuff, and he's not good at filtering himself when he's speaking off the cuff. So in my opinion, he was thinking about how, like, on the campaign trail, the things he kept saying about, you know, we're sending aid here and there and blah, blah, blah. I said all this at the beginning of the stream too, so I'm going to try not to repeat myself too much. But when we send aid to other countries, it is oftentimes with a stipulation that they're going to have to do things our way. And they're not always okay with that. So Ukraine situation is obviously different than, like, you know, Iran or Iraq or Afghanistan situation. But at the same time, we still do need to be looking carefully at the kind of situation that we are having a hand in, especially in these other countries where it's hard for us to know, you know, all the way across the world what's going on. So, I mean, I think he was fed some bad information, and so I think that's why he was maybe being, you know, uncooperative with this or that, and why he probably said some of the things that he said. I don't think that him saying that, you know, oh, take her out, I don't think that he was necessarily thinking that he's a mob boss and thinking about, because he doesn't think of himself really as like somebody that has this military power where what he says off the cuff or on Twitter is going to have some kind of military action where, like, people's lives are going to be put in danger. He does not think about that. People have criticized him on this many, many, many times. But if you believe that, then that means you also have to think that when he said take her out, it meant as in take her out of the position, not like put a hit out on her, you know? So that's my opinion. I don't like the obstruction of Congress. I do think that all of the branches of government should be communicating a lot more. Communication is the key, people. And so I wish that they would be able to subpoena and to get information between this person and that person, but there's a lot of mistrust that's going on in our government right now. There's a lot of leaks that are happening to the press that aren't, like, it's not like whistleblower kinds of leaks. It's like people trying to diss this person or that person, you know? And it's not even something that ends up getting investigated and changed. It's just like people are pissy at each other. So, whatever. So that's my take on that. And I guess I'm going to go back and edit these two streams separate. So that way, it's not just stuck together as one thing. I'm sorry I had to pull away from the impeachment trials, but, there's other stuff going on. And I think that sometimes they try to make something like an impeachment trial or some other kind of really popular thing that's going on. They stretch the news out on it as long as they can so that they can try to hide all of these other things. And as we went over in the beginning of the stream, they had about 10 different hearings that were happening this morning at the same time. And they had 2 this afternoon. There was another one on religious persecution. So, they have a lot of stuff going on, and everybody's just talking about the impeachment trials. So I thought I would switch over to this. I don't want you guys thinking all I do is the impeachment trials. So, and if you're interested in checking out all of the other kinds of content that we make, then, feel free to do so, please. Your guys' views and your watch time and sharing the videos and the streams and everything, that is how this channel is growing. And thank you guys so much for that, because otherwise, if it weren't for you guys, I wouldn't be growing. So thank you so much. And remember, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram. @GrowTheInfo is our handle, and on our website, growtheinfo.com, we have press releases and resources, and there's a forum, a message forum, if you guys want to check that out. So thank you guys so much for joining. I hope you have a wonderful day. Let's put on a few tunes while we get out of here. Is there anybody else that I need to say goodbye to in the chat? No? Okay, just a bunch of lurkers while we close out. That's cool. That's gravy with me. It's been a long day. Can you tell? I can't find the right screen. My end screen. There we go. Alright, thank you guys so much for joining. Make sure that you're subscribed because I am working on that Wuhan virus video. So, subscribe and turn on bell notifications, and thank you guys so much, and all of my new subscribers. YouTube it's bad about showing me the notifications and the names, so I don't know who to thank, but thank you so much. You guys are wonderful. I hope you have a wonderful day.